I had been meaning to take a solo camping trip for a while. I'd always gone with someone, either a friend or my brother, but this time, I wanted to try it alone. I had read online that solo camping helps you reset your mind, feel more connected with nature, and test your survival skills a bit. That all sounded good to me. I worked long hours at my job in IT, and my mind was constantly crowded with problems that didn't feel like they really mattered. I needed a break. I picked a remote spot in Central Oregon that wasn't too far from where I lived in Portland. It was called Bitter Creek Forest, and it was deep enough in that you wouldn't see many people, especially during the off-season. It was early October, right before the cold really started to bite. I planned for 2 nights. I checked the weather, packed everything carefully: tent, tarp, food, cooking gear, water filter, knife, fire starter, extra batteries, bear spray. I even brought a book and a small solar charger for my phone. I made a checklist and went over it twice. The drive took about 3 hours. The last hour was a slow, winding road up through thick woods. I lost cell signal about halfway through. By the time I got to the parking area, it was around 2 in the afternoon. There was only one other car parked there. That comforted me a little. It meant someone else was probably out there, maybe not too far off. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started the hike in. The trail was well maintained, and the air was cool but not too cold. Leaves crunched under my boots, and the wind moved through the tall pine trees with a soft rushing sound. I hiked for about an hour and a half before I found a good spot. It was flat and open enough for my tent, but still surrounded by trees on 3 sides. About 30 feet away was a small creek with clear running water. I could filter drinking water from it. I checked around for animal tracks, droppings, or anything that might suggest a bad idea. Nothing looked concerning. I set up my tent, laid out the tarp, arranged my cooking area away from where I'd be sleeping, and gathered some dry wood. I even made a small ring of stones for the fire pit. I cooked some rice and beans for dinner over the small stove and watched the sky turn orange behind the trees. It was peaceful, quiet in a way I wasn't used to anymore. No cars, no people, no humming electronics. Just wind, leaves, and the sound of the creek. When it got dark, it got really dark. I had a headlamp, but even that felt weak in the thick woods. I kept the fire going a little longer, then doused it carefully and crawled into my tent. I laid there, listening to the night sounds, the crackling of branches, distant rustles, maybe animals moving through the brush, but nothing that alarmed me. I was used to this from other camping trips. The first night passed without anything weird. I woke up a few times, mostly from cold or the usual awkwardness of sleeping on the ground, but nothing strange. I got up early, made coffee, filtered water, and walked around the area a bit. I didn't see any signs of other people. No campsites nearby, no trash, no distant voices or fires the night before. I was probably alone out here. I spent most of the day walking some of the trails. I went maybe 3 or 4 miles out and looped back, just enjoying being disconnected from everything. When I returned to camp around mid-afternoon, I noticed something odd. My cooking pot had moved. I had left it near the fire pit, upside down and clean. Now it was about 5 feet away, lying on its side. At first, I figured it might have rolled, but the ground was flat. No slope, no wind. It didn't make sense, but I brushed it off. Maybe I kicked it earlier without noticing. Still, I made a mental note. I cooked a simple dinner again, cleaned up, and settled in for the second night. This time, I felt more aware. I listened more closely to the sounds outside the tent. I was more alert. There's something about being alone in the woods on the second night. The novelty wears off a bit, and your mind starts to wander into uncomfortable places. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound, a snapping twig. Not just once, repeated cracks like footsteps. I froze. I was lying on my back in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. I turned off my headlamp. The sound moved, slow, like someone or something was circling. It wasn't an animal scurrying or foraging. It was steady, deliberate. Step, pause. Step, pause. I reached slowly for my bear spray and my knife. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't want to make noise. I just laid there, waiting, breathing quietly. The sound stopped for a while. Then I heard another soft crack. Closer this time, maybe 20 feet away. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I laid there, completely still, gripping the spray, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, the sky lightened. Birds started chirping. I got up stiff and tired, unzipped the tent, and looked around. Nothing. No tracks. No sign of anyone. But when I looked at my cooking area, the pot was gone. Completely gone. I searched for it, thinking maybe an animal dragged it off. I found it 15 feet away in the bushes, upside down like someone placed it there. That rattled me. I told myself it could have been a raccoon or even a bear, but bears would leave messes. They don't carefully move objects. I sat there with my coffee, thinking. I had one night left, but now I wasn't sure I wanted to stay. I hated the idea of backing out early, but something felt wrong. I made the decision to stay, but I took precautions. I packed everything into my backpack and left it by the tent. If I had to leave quickly, I didn't want to waste time gathering things. I kept the bear spray in my sleeping bag with me, the knife within reach. I built a small perimeter of rocks and sticks around my tent, just enough to make noise if someone or something approached. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to give away my position. I sat in the tent for a long time before lying down. I felt on edge the entire time, like something was just out of sight, waiting. Around midnight, I started hearing noises again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard a thud, like something heavy being dropped. Then I heard a dragging sound. It wasn't constant. It would start, stop, start again. At one point, something hit the tent, lightly like a stick being tapped against it. I jerked upright, heart pounding, holding the spray. I stayed like that for hours. The sounds would go away for a bit, then return, as if someone was deliberately trying to keep me awake. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally came up, I burst out of the tent and looked around. The rocks and sticks I had placed around the tent had been moved. Some were gone. One of the sticks had been propped upright, pushed into the ground like a marker. That's when I knew this wasn't an animal. Someone was out here. Someone who knew where I was. Someone who had been watching, playing games. I didn't eat. I didn't even boil water. I packed up my tent as fast as I could, threw everything into my backpack, and started hiking out. I didn't stop to rest. I checked behind me constantly. I tried to move fast but quiet. Every sound made me jump. A branch snapped. Was it just a deer, or was I being followed? It took me nearly 2 hours to get back to the parking lot. When I saw my car, I almost cried from relief. But when I got closer, my stomach dropped. The back of my car was open. Not just unlocked, open. The hatch door was up. I had locked it, I was sure. My emergency supplies were still there, jumper cables, extra water, flares. Nothing seemed stolen, but someone had definitely opened it. I checked the inside carefully. Nothing planted, nothing missing. I slammed the hatch shut, jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't look back. When I got back to Portland, I filed a report with the local ranger station. They didn't seem too surprised. One of the officers said that sometimes people squat out there, or loners get a little weird. They didn't offer much help. They said they'd send someone out to check the area, but I doubt they ever did. I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. And when I finally did, it was with friends in well-trafficked campgrounds with other people nearby. I still think about it. The footsteps, the missing pot, the tapping on the tent, the stick pushed into the ground like a warning. I try to tell myself it was just a crazy drifter or someone messing around, but deep down, I know they were watching me. From the moment I set up camp, someone knew I was there. They didn't take anything. They didn't attack. They didn't speak. They just made sure I knew I wasn't alone. That's what stayed with me. The idea that someone was out there, just a few feet beyond the trees, completely silent, watching me sleep, watching me eat, waiting for nightfall. I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. It was the last week of September when I took time off from work and decided to go on a solo camping trip in the northern woods of Michigan. I had been stressed out for months, just working long days at the warehouse, dealing with people, traffic, noise, everything piling up on me. I didn't want to go somewhere touristy or flashy. I wanted to go somewhere quiet and isolated, where I could hear myself breathe, maybe fish a little, sit by the fire, and just reset my brain. I picked a spot I found online, a remote lake near the Upper Peninsula, barely marked on any map, surrounded by thick forest and only accessible by an old logging trail. The few reviews I found talked about how peaceful it was and how you were unlikely to see anyone else for days. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, fishing rod, a cooler, fire starter, a few knives, a small hatchet, 2 flashlights, extra batteries, and my old .22 rifle. I never really expected to use it, but I always brought it just in case I ran into a bear or something. The weather was supposed to be clear, maybe a little chilly at night, but nothing too harsh. I left early that morning, got coffee at a gas station on the way, and drove 5 hours north. The further I got, the fewer cars I saw. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road, and after about 30 minutes of slow, bumpy driving, I reached the trailhead. The parking area was just a flat patch of dirt with enough space for maybe 2 cars. There weren't any other vehicles there. I parked, double-checked my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown in places and barely visible in others. It wound through thick woods for about 3 miles until I reached the lake. It was just as beautiful as I'd imagined. The water was still and black, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees. No signs of people, no sound but the breeze and birds. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, where the ground was flat and covered in pine needles. I had a good view of the water and enough distance from the trees to be safe from falling branches. After setting everything up, I gathered wood and built a fire pit with stones. I cooked some sausages over the flames and ate as the sun dipped behind the trees, turning the lake orange. That night, I slept harder than I had in months. Just the sound of leaves and crickets outside, the cold air pressing against the sides of the tent, and nothing else. The next 2 days were the same kind of peaceful. I spent my time walking around the lake, fishing, reading, and just sitting still. I didn't bring my phone except for emergencies, and I left it off most of the time. I saw deer once, drinking at the far side of the lake, and watched a bald eagle skim across the water. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how noisy your life usually is. On the 3rd night, something felt a little off. I had gone to sleep like usual, after eating and tending the fire until it burned down to coals. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, not suddenly, just kind of slowly becoming aware that I was awake. There wasn't any sound, not even the usual rustling or insects. I thought maybe I'd just been dreaming, but I had that odd feeling you get when your instincts are trying to tell you something. I stayed still for a long time, listening. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finally unzipped the tent quietly and stuck my head out. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of the trees, and the lake was smooth like glass. I waited, staring at the woods, trying to pick out any movement, but everything looked still. I figured it was just my imagination and went back inside, but I left my boots near the zipper in case I needed to get out quickly. It took me a while to fall back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately noticed something strange. There were small marks in the dirt near the fire pit. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, maybe raccoons or something, but they didn't look quite right. They were shallow, narrow, and came in from the woods. They stopped about 10 feet from the tent and then went back the way they came. I crouched down and studied them for a while, trying to figure out what made them. The shape wasn't right for deer or coyotes, and they were too far apart for smaller animals. They looked almost like the indentations of shoes, but not deep enough to be from someone walking normally. I brushed it off. Maybe it was an animal I wasn't familiar with. Maybe the ground was just soft in places and made weird shapes. I kept telling myself not to let my imagination get carried away. Still, I couldn't get that feeling out of my head, that sense of being watched. That day, I went for a longer hike, trying to shake off the unease. I circled the lake, taking my time, looking for signs of other people or anything unusual. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I didn't even see any birds, which felt strange. Normally, you'd hear at least the occasional woodpecker or squirrel. It was like everything had packed up and left. I got back to camp around 5 p.m. and rebuilt the fire. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling jumpy. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I cooked some food and ate fast, and by the time the sun went down, I was already on edge. I made sure everything was locked up in the bear canister and pulled into the tent early. I lay there in my sleeping bag, flashlight in my hand, rifle next to me, just staring at the ceiling of the tent. Around midnight, I heard it. A single footstep outside. Just one. The kind of sound someone makes when they step on a branch and break it under their weight. Not a crash, not a bunch of movement, just one deliberate, quiet snap. I didn't move. My heart started racing, and my ears strained to pick up any follow-up noise. But there was nothing. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then I heard a faint shuffle, like something brushing against the edge of the tent, down near my feet. I didn't even breathe. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. My other hand was slowly moving toward the rifle. I wrapped my fingers around it and waited. Every muscle in my body was locked. Another few minutes passed. Then silence again. I stayed like that for at least an hour, barely blinking. I don't think I slept at all. Eventually, the sky started to lighten outside, and I felt safe enough to move. I unzipped the tent slowly and crawled out. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were boot prints all around my tent. Human boot prints. They circled the whole thing. Some passed close by the fire pit, others led toward the woods. There were at least a dozen different impressions in the pine needles and dirt, and they weren't mine. I checked. My boots were still inside the tent, dry and clean. I hadn't walked around that night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. Then I walked toward the trees, trying to follow them. They led about 20 feet into the woods and then just vanished. The pine needles made it hard to track, and I couldn't tell where the person had come from or gone. But someone had definitely been there, watching me. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly. Just jammed everything into my pack. I kept the rifle in my hands the whole time. When I was ready, I started hiking back down the trail, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods were still too quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. About halfway back to my truck, I noticed something else. A broken tree branch hanging low over the trail, about chest height. That hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been snapped intentionally and bent across the path. I stepped over it and kept moving. Another 100 yards down, I saw a pile of small rocks stacked in the middle of the trail. That hadn't been there either. Someone was following me, or maybe they'd been ahead of me. I picked up the pace, trying not to run but moving fast. I gripped the rifle tighter, constantly scanning the trees. The last half mile felt like it took an hour. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost broke into a sprint. The truck was untouched. I got in, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I just drove. The tires skidded a little on the dirt as I pulled out, and I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road. It took me a few hours to fully calm down. I stopped at a diner about 50 miles south and sat there with a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything. The prints, the noise, the rearranged trail. None of it made sense unless someone had been out there, watching me, messing with me. But why? There was nothing valuable in my camp. No one had taken anything. They could have hurt me, but they didn't. They just watched. When I got home, I didn't unpack right away. I left everything in the garage and sat in the living room with the curtains closed. For days, I kept thinking about those boot prints and the sound of that single footstep outside my tent. I checked local news for anything about missing people or strange reports near that lake. But there was nothing. I didn't report it to the police. What would I even say? I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about it sometimes. About how far away that place was, how quiet it was, how whoever was out there knew I was alone. I think that's what gets me the most. They knew I was by myself. They knew exactly where I was. I was 34 when I took the trip. It was late October 2021. My name is Brian Mercer. I'm a freelance photographer, mostly doing work for real estate and nature magazines. I've been living in Spokane, Washington for a few years by then, and I'd gotten into a habit of doing solo trips out to remote places whenever I felt burned out from editing and deadlines. That year, the burnout hit harder than usual. I had just wrapped up back-to-back contracts for 3 real estate firms and had barely stepped outside in weeks. I found the cabin listing on a website that hosts lesser-known rentals, especially off-grid types. It wasn't Airbnb, more niche. The place was on private land near Coldwater Lake, just southwest of Mount St. Helens. It was advertised as a true solitude experience, with no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. The listing said it had solar panels for basic power and a well with a hand pump. The owner, a guy named Dennis, had a bunch of reviews from people who stayed there over the years. No red flags. I booked it for 6 nights. I left Spokane early on a Sunday morning. The drive took me about 6 hours with a few stops for gas and food. By the time I got close to the property, the road had narrowed to a winding gravel trail lined with tall pines. The elevation increased gradually, and the air turned crisp. I rolled down the window and took it in. It smelled like wet bark and dry leaves. My favorite kind of air. The last part of the road was barely a road at all, just 2 narrow tire paths in the dirt. I followed the email directions exactly, past an old metal gate left open, and finally saw the cabin tucked between 2 steep ridges, maybe 100 yards back from the lake's edge. It was surrounded by evergreens on all sides, dense and dark, except in one direction where the water reflected the pale gray sky. The cabin itself was older than I expected, but solid. A-frame style with a small front porch, weathered wooden siding, and a metal chimney poking through the top. There was a steel fire pit off to the side with a few damp logs stacked nearby. Everything looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. That was fine with me. I wanted quiet, and that's what I got. Inside, the cabin had a single room with a loft above. The main floor had a wood stove, a cot with thick wool blankets, a table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen with a propane stove and a hand-pumped sink. The fridge was a cooler box that drained into a bucket. No plumbing, no thermostat, no insulation. Just wood, nails, and space. The loft had a thin mattress and a dusty window that looked out toward the ridge. By the time I got settled and stacked my camera gear by the table, it was late afternoon. I didn't feel like shooting anything yet. I took a walk down to the lake instead, watching the clouds drift low over the water. The silence out there was heavier than I expected. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence where your ears ring and you notice every movement in the trees. I stood there for a while, letting the calm dig into me. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the wood stove, heated some canned soup, and read a paperback until the warmth made me drowsy. I slept in the loft. The mattress was stiff and smelled like old pine, but I was tired enough not to care. I fell asleep to the sound of wind brushing against the siding. The second day, I started shooting. I walked the perimeter of the lake with my camera, stopping to photograph moss-covered stumps, ripples in the water, and clusters of red and gold leaves still clinging to their branches. I didn't see another person all day, not even a distant boat or a parked truck. It was total isolation. I liked it. That night, I was sitting outside by the fire pit around 8 p.m. I hadn't used it yet, just sitting on the edge with a headlamp on, editing photos on my laptop until the battery died. The temperature had dropped fast after sundown. My breath came out in little clouds. The trees around the clearing were black outlines now. I remember hearing something then, not close, not loud, but definitely out of place. It was a faint metallic clink, like a tool knocking against another, maybe a hammer or wrench. It came from somewhere up the ridge behind the cabin. I looked up instinctively, but all I saw was darkness. The ridge rose sharply about 150 feet behind the cabin and disappeared into heavy forest. No trails up that way, at least not marked ones. I listened for a while, but the sound didn't repeat. I told myself it was nothing. Could have been a branch falling onto a rock or something shifting in the cold. That area used to have logging operations decades ago. Maybe old junk was still up there. I turned in early that night, a little uneasy, but not enough to ruin the trip. The next day, I shot more photos in the opposite direction, trying to get a better angle on the ridge and the lake. I didn't think much about the noise from the night before until I found something strange while hiking back. About 30 yards uphill behind the cabin, I saw a narrow indentation in the ground, mostly covered by ferns and rotting leaves. It wasn't a trail exactly, but it looked like something had been regularly moving through there, flattening the plants in a straight line up the slope. Curious, I followed it for maybe 10 minutes until the incline got too steep and the brush too thick. I didn't find anything obvious. No shack, no campsite, nothing fresh. Still, the track was odd. Too narrow and too consistent to be an animal trail. It looked methodical. I made a mental note and turned back. That night, the sound came again. Same metallic clinking, same location. This time it lasted longer, maybe 5 or 6 faint taps in a row. I froze on the porch, ears straining. Then silence again. No footsteps, no voices, just that strange sound echoing off the trees and then nothing. I didn't sleep well. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was camping illegally on the ridge. Maybe a hunter was setting up a blind. Maybe it was just old junk shifting as the temperature dropped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was up there moving around, watching, maybe. On the 4th day, I hiked around the ridge, trying to come at it from the west side where the incline wasn't so bad. I had my camera, a knife, and a pair of binoculars. I wasn't looking for trouble, just answers. The forest was dense, and the terrain rough. Fallen logs, thorny bushes, and loose rocks made it slow going. About halfway up, I found something that made my stomach flip. It was a tree, or rather, what someone had done to it. The trunk had been shaved flat on one side, and into the exposed wood, someone had carved dozens of straight lines, all parallel, all perfectly spaced. They weren't words or symbols, just lines. Rows and rows of them like tally marks but with no grouping. It must have taken hours. The bark shavings were still on the ground, pale and curling. It was recent. I backed off, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods were again. No birds, no insects, just wind and leaves. I didn't go higher. I turned around and got back to the cabin before dark. That night, I stayed inside, locked the door, even though the listing had said there was no real need for it. I kept the fire small and the lights off. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching the rocks softly, like someone trying not to be noticed. They circled the cabin once, then nothing. I waited, clutching my knife, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't go to the window. I didn't want to see. By dawn, the footsteps were gone. No knock, no attempt to break in. Just a slow, quiet circle and silence. When I finally stepped outside that morning, I found one thing out of place. A single boot print, deep and wide, in the soft dirt behind the cabin. Too big to be mine, too fresh to be old. That was the turning point. I packed my gear and loaded the car. I didn't care if I had 2 nights left. I was done. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The battery was dead. I tried again. Nothing. Not even a click. I popped the hood, checked the cables, everything looked fine. No obvious damage. I walked back to the cabin and tried to calm down. I didn't have cell service. The nearest road was a 2-hour hike downhill. I had enough food and water, but the idea of staying another night after what I'd seen, what I'd heard, was unbearable. I decided to hike out. I packed a bag with essentials, left a note in case someone found the cabin, and locked up. I left around 10 a.m., following the gravel path back down the hill. About an hour into the hike, I heard something behind me. Not close, not loud, just the unmistakable sound of footsteps on dry leaves. I stopped. They stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then I started walking again. They followed. This continued for almost a mile. Every time I stopped, the sound stopped. When I moved, it resumed, always at the edge of hearing. I never saw anyone. The forest was too thick. By the time I reached the gate at the bottom of the property, the sounds had stopped. The rest of the way to the highway was My name is Evan Reed. I was 31 when this happened, summer of 2017. I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time, and I worked in maintenance for a community college. Not the worst job. Paid okay, quiet work. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship back then. For years with a woman I'd thought I'd marry, but things fell apart slowly, then all at once. You know how it goes. I needed time to clear my head, so I figured I'd do a solo trip. I'd camped plenty as a kid, and I'd done some solo trips before, though none more than a weekend. This time, I wanted something longer, just me and silence. I rented a small, off-grid cabin for 2 weeks up in northeastern Washington, near Colville National Forest. The cabin sat way back in the woods, about 5 miles from the nearest dirt road. You had to park your car at a clearing, then hike in with your gear. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a rain barrel, and a composting toilet out back. The cabin was owned by some older guy named Murray, retired forestry worker. He built the place himself back in the 80s. I found it listed on some backwoods rental site. The pictures made it look perfect. Just a simple wooden structure with thick forest all around and a small creek nearby. I got there on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. It had been a dry summer, so the trail leading to the cabin was dusty and cracked. It took me nearly 2 hours to haul all my stuff in. 2 trips with my gear, cooler, tools, food, and a small solar charger I brought for my phone, though I knew there was no signal out there. When I finally stepped into the cabin, the heat hit me right away. It was stifling inside, and the windows had all been shut for who knows how long. Dust floated in the light beams cutting through the small front window. I opened every window and propped the door for airflow. The place was simple, just a twin bed, a table, a shelf with some old paperbacks, a few pots and pans, and a little wood stove in the corner. There was a logbook on the table with names and short entries going back 20 years. I flipped through a few. Most people had only stayed a couple nights. A few had left little hand-drawn maps of good hiking trails nearby. One guy had scribbled a whole page about watching a bobcat down by the creek. After settling in, I spent that first evening just unwinding. I cooked some pasta on my camp stove outside and sat on a log watching the sky turn orange. I remember the quiet, that kind of quiet you only get way out in the woods, where there's no hum of cars or appliances, just the occasional bird call, the wind through the trees, and your own breathing. The first night passed without anything strange. I slept hard. Too hard, actually. Woke up drenched in sweat around 2 a.m. because I forgot how warm those old sleeping bags get in summer. I got up, splashed water from the rain barrel on my face, then went back to bed. Took me a while to fall asleep again. Every little rustle outside the cabin set my ears up. A branch snapping, leaves crunching, normal wood stuff, but when you're alone, even a raccoon sounds like a person. The second day, I hiked around and found that creek maybe half a mile south of the cabin. The water was low but cold and clean. I filled up a few bottles and ran them through the filter I brought. I spotted deer tracks in the mud. Some small ones too, maybe a fawn. I also found what looked like a hunting blind up in a tree about 20 minutes from the cabin. It was old, falling apart, but it had good sight lines over a wide slope. I climbed up just to see, and when I looked back the way I'd come, I realized how easy it was to get turned around. Everything looked the same, green and brown and still. That evening, I built a small fire in the pit outside and cooked sausages. Sat by the fire until it was just glowing coals. I watched the trees sway under the moonlight and felt that calm again. I remember thinking I could really spend a lot more time out there. Maybe I'd come back in the fall when it was cooler. The weird stuff didn't start until the third night. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. to a noise outside. Something fast and light, like feet moving across the leaves. Not a thud, more like a patter. I sat up, heart already going. I listened hard, holding my breath. There it was again. A quick rustle, then nothing. Now, I'm not the paranoid type, but I'm not stupid either. I knew animals came around cabins, raccoons, maybe even a bear if you left food out. But I'd been careful. Food was stored in a cooler, locked and weighted. Trash tied up and hung in a tree away from the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window. Nothing. just trees and shadows. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside barefoot, flashlight in hand. I swept it around. Still nothing. Then I noticed something odd. The firewood I'd stacked on the side of the cabin had been moved. Not all of it, just enough that it looked wrong. 2 or 3 pieces had been taken from the middle of the stack and placed on the ground, a few feet away, like someone had pulled them out and then dropped them there. That's not something an animal would do. I knelt down and looked at the dirt. I thought I saw a print. Maybe a shoe, maybe just where the wood had fallen. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat inside with the flashlight on and my multi-tool in hand, listening. By morning, I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I'd stacked the wood wrong and it fell. Maybe a deer kicked it. Still, I felt weird. I did a big loop hike that day to clear my head. Took about 4 hours through some rocky ridges to the north and back through thicker pine forest. Found some elk droppings and a weird metal box half buried in the dirt. Just an old toolbox, rusted shut. Probably a hunter left it there years ago. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat inside and read an old paperback someone had left behind. Some western from the 70s. Around midnight, I turned in, but I didn't sleep well. At 3:12 a.m., I remember because I checked my watch, I heard tapping. Not knocking, tapping. On the side of the cabin. Soft, like someone drumming fingers on the wood. I froze. The sound moved. Tap, tap. Then a few seconds of silence. Then again on the back wall. Then the side window. I didn't move. I just listened, every muscle locked. Then nothing. No footsteps. No crunching leaves. Just silence. I stayed like that for an hour until the sun started to rise. That morning I checked around the cabin. No tracks. No marks. But again, something small was off. My pack, the one I'd left just inside the door, was now sitting just outside, propped up against the cabin wall. I didn't move it. No animal would have dragged it like that and not torn into it. I started thinking about heading out early. I had about 8 days left in the rental, but I started making plans. I wasn't scared exactly, just uneasy, like someone was watching the place. I hiked out to where the trail meets the clearing where my car was. I didn't see anyone. No other cars, but I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A pile of stones had been stacked next to the trail. Perfect little stack about knee-high, like a cairn but recent. Moss hadn't grown on them yet, and I didn't remember it being there when I came in. I picked one of the stones up. Underneath, I saw something dark, a scrap of fabric, navy blue. I pulled it out and found it was a piece of synthetic jacket, like from a windbreaker, torn. I didn't know what to make of it, but it put me on edge. That night I didn't cook, just ate a protein bar and stayed inside. Kept my light off, just sat by the window looking out into the woods. I thought I saw movement a few times, shadows between trees. Could have been animals, could have been nothing. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed everything. I made 2 fast trips to the car, heart pounding every time I left the cabin. I didn't hear or see anything, but the woods felt charged, like the air before a storm. When I got back to the car on my second trip, I found something that made my knees go weak. On the hood of my Subaru was a handprint. Not a smudge, not dirt. A full, clear print made in ash, like someone with dirty hands had pressed their palm flat on the metal. It wasn't there an hour earlier. I loaded up the last of my stuff and drove out without looking back. I reported it to the county sheriff's office when I got back to town. They said they'd send someone to check it out. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I never heard back. 2 weeks later, I got a text from the rental site. The listing for the cabin had been removed. No explanation, just gone. I still think about it sometimes. Not every day, but enough. Someone was out there, not some crazy killer or forest spirit. Just a person, watching, testing, waiting maybe, and I think if I'd stayed one more night, I might have found out why, or I wouldn't be telling this story at all. My name is Darren Collins. I'm 32 now, but this happened when I was 28, back in late September of 2020. I remember the exact date, September 26th, because it was a Saturday, and I had taken the Friday off to get a long weekend out in the woods. I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time, working as a delivery truck driver, and had gotten used to early mornings, quiet roads, and long stretches of time alone. So camping solo wasn't anything strange for me. In fact, I preferred it that way. The spot I chose was in the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, about a 3-hour drive from Spokane if you count the winding dirt roads. It's a massive area. Tons of people go there for hiking, hunting, and camping. But if you drive in far enough and step off the main trail, you can easily go days without seeing another person. That was the plan. Just me, my pack, my tent, and the stillness of the forest. I brought everything I needed: a 4-day supply of food, water purification tablets, a sturdy 2-person tent, which is roomier when you're solo, my knife, a small hatchet, my jet boil for making coffee and quick meals, and a weatherproof duffel for my clothes and gear. I also had a Garmin InReach Mini just in case. I don't mess around when it comes to safety, even if I'm going out alone. I parked the truck at a dead-end spur trail, locked it up, and hiked in about 6 miles off the main road. My final campsite was on a slight rise near a shallow stream, surrounded by dense trees on 3 sides. From that little hill, I could look out through the trees to a wide clearing below, a rocky meadow with patchy grass and fallen logs. There were no signs of anyone having camped there recently. No fire pits, no trash, nothing. It felt untouched. I liked that. I spent the first evening setting up my tent, gathering deadfall for a small campfire, and boiling some water for instant ramen. The air smelled like pine and moss, and the temperature was dropping faster than I expected. I had my layers, so I wasn't worried, but I zipped into my sleeping bag early that night and fell asleep to the sound of the stream trickling down the rocks. The first full day was peaceful. I hiked about 3 miles north of camp, just exploring. Saw some elk tracks, spotted a fox, and startled a couple of grouse. I didn't see another human the whole day. The sun stayed out, and by the time I got back to camp in the early afternoon, I was looking forward to a quiet evening. I cooked a freeze-dried meal and watched the sun go down through the trees. Around dusk, I thought I heard something off in the distance. Not an animal, not natural. It was a sharp sound, rhythmic, almost like metal clinking, but it was faint and far off, maybe across the meadow or farther. I stood still for a long time trying to catch it again, but it stopped. I chalked it up to wind or maybe some animal stepping on an old bit of junk left behind by hunters or hikers years ago. You can still find rusted cans and broken tools out in these woods if you look hard enough. I didn't think too much of it. That night, I lay awake a little longer than usual, listening. But the forest went quiet. Just the usual creaks of trees, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. The second day is when things started to get strange. I woke up around 6. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but there was enough light to see the outline of the trees through the mesh of my tent. I sat up in my sleeping bag, stretched, and unzipped the tent to let in the cold morning air. That's when I noticed something that didn't sit right. On the edge of the clearing, down at the bottom of the hill where the tree line began again, there was something on the ground. It was dark, maybe a stump or a pile of something, but I hadn't seen it the day before. I pulled out my little binoculars from my pack and took a look. It wasn't a stump. It looked like a bundle of fabric, maybe a jacket or a tarp, but it was just laying there about 50 yards away, half in the grass and half in the dirt. It gave me a weird feeling, like something had changed in the night and I hadn't noticed. I thought maybe a hunter had dropped it or left it behind. Still, I didn't feel like walking down to check it out just yet. I made coffee and sat by the fire pit, glancing down at the thing every now and then. It didn't move. By late morning, I gave in to curiosity and hiked down toward it. As I got closer, I could see it was a jacket, a heavy-duty canvas one, dark green, covered in dirt and pine needles like it had been dragged. I poked it with a stick. Nothing underneath it. No bag, no gear, just the jacket. I picked it up carefully and shook it out. No name tag, no wallet, no ID. Just torn lining and a busted zipper. It looked old, but not ancient. A couple years, maybe. I left it where it was and walked a bit farther into the tree line, just scanning for signs of anyone. No footprints, no boot marks, no other gear. After about 10 minutes, I circled back and went up the hill to camp. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Someone ditched it or lost it, but the forest felt different now, like I wasn't really alone anymore. That night, I didn't make a fire. I just ate a cold meal and stayed quiet, sitting in the tent with the flap unzipped so I could look out into the dark. I didn't use my headlamp much, just tried to let my eyes adjust. It was close to midnight when I heard something again. Not metal this time, not sharp. It was soft, a crunch, then another, then silence. It was footsteps. I know what footsteps sound like in the woods. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I stayed frozen, staring out into the black, waiting. My hand was on my knife, my body stiff. The steps didn't get closer, but they didn't move away either. Then I heard a stick snap, closer, maybe 30 feet from the tent, off to the right near the cluster of trees. I didn't move. I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. Then silence again. Eventually, I clicked on my headlamp and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing, just trunks and darkness. I stepped outside and swept the light around the clearing. No movement, no sounds. The air was freezing. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I walked the edge of the campsite looking for signs. I found 2 faint prints in the dirt by the stream. Big prints. Hiking boots, not wildlife. They were facing the tent. No prints leading away, just those 2. The rest had been wiped out by the frost or leaves. I decided I'd leave a day early. Something wasn't right. I packed my gear in a hurry, took down the tent, and started the long hike back toward the truck. I was about halfway, maybe 3 miles in, when I noticed something that made me stop cold. On a tree about 10 feet off the trail, there was a strip of red cloth tied around the trunk. Bright red, like flagging tape, but it wasn't plastic. It was fabric. Torn shirt, maybe. Another 100 feet down the trail, there was another one. Same height, same kind of fabric. This one had a bit of dirt on it, like it had been dragged. My brain went into overdrive. Was someone marking my route? Had they been following me? I kept walking faster now. Every little sound made me stop and look back. The forest was too quiet. I reached my truck just after noon. Everything looked the same. No damage, no signs of anyone tampering with it. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back, and got inside. As I turned the key, I felt this overwhelming flood of relief. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until that moment. I drove straight back to Spokane. Didn't stop. Didn't eat. When I got home, I reported what happened to the local ranger station. I told them about the jacket, the footsteps, the prints, the fabric strips. They took it seriously but said it wasn't uncommon to find strange things in the woods. People dump stuff. Hunters get careless. And yeah, sometimes weirdos camp out off-grid. A few days later, I got a call. They'd sent someone to check the area. They found the jacket. They also found more of those red fabric strips, deeper in the woods, all in a pattern. They said it looked like someone had been using them to track movement or mark paths. But no one was there when they searched. No camps, no recent fires, no people. Just markers. The ranger told me I was smart to leave when I did. He didn't say much else. That was almost 5 years ago. I still go camping, but not alone. Not out that far. I stick to areas with cell service and other people nearby. I've learned to trust my gut. When something feels off in the woods, it probably is. What scares me the most is not what I saw. It's what I didn't. Who was out there? What did they want? Why were they marking my path? And why did they stop just short of the tent? I'll never know. But I still think about those footsteps at night, the ones that never came any closer, but never went away either. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. My friends and I had planned a trip to a remote cabin tucked away in the woods for a weekend of peace, relaxation, and a bit of hiking. The idea of being away from the hustle and bustle of daily life felt like the perfect way to recharge. It was early fall. The leaves had started to turn golden, and the air had a crisp bite to it that made it feel like everything was fresh and new. The cabin was located somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, in a part of West Virginia where cell service was non-existent, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The sort of place where the only sounds you'd hear at night were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. I had rented the place online after seeing a couple of photos, nothing fancy, but exactly what we were looking for. A simple, secluded cabin with a fireplace, a porch with a view, and a couple of old wooden rocking chairs on it. A place to get away from everything. The website mentioned how the cabin had been built in the 1960s, and from the photos it looked like it hadn't changed much since then. I liked that. It was part of its charm. I packed my bags the night before the trip, feeling excited but also a little uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on why I felt that way, but I chalked it up to the nerves I always get before heading into unfamiliar places. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't dread, just a sense of something unknown lurking just under the surface. The drive there was long, about 4 hours from the city, and the road narrowed the further we went. We passed small towns, then dirt roads, and eventually found ourselves on a gravel path that twisted through dense woods. My friend, Ben, who had driven most of the way, was starting to get a little irritated. He'd had a rough week at work, and I could tell the winding roads were testing his patience. The sun was setting by the time we finally reached the cabin, and the darkening sky made the place look even more isolated. There were no other houses in sight. I wasn't sure if I liked that or not, but it was too late to turn back now. I was eager to get inside, unpack, and start the weekend. We parked the car in front of the cabin and unloaded our things. The cabin looked exactly as I had remembered from the pictures. A 2-story wooden structure with a steep roof, a chimney, and large windows that let in a lot of light. The porch was covered with a thick layer of dust, but it still had its charm. The kind of charm you'd expect from a place that had seen many seasons, but had remained mostly untouched by time. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine wood and a slight musky scent that I couldn't place. The living room was modest, with a stone fireplace, an old wooden coffee table, and a couple of worn-out sofas. There was a small kitchen to the left, and a staircase leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor. The wood beams in the ceiling were dark, and the floor creaked under our footsteps. It felt like a place frozen in time. And in some strange way, I liked that. We set up for the night, lit a fire in the fireplace, and unpacked our food and drinks. Ben opened a few beers, and we all sat around the fire, talking about random stuff. It felt good to be away from everything, to just relax and enjoy the company. The weather outside had turned cooler, and the wind started to pick up, making the trees outside sway and groan. That's when I started feeling it, the quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind of silence that feels a bit too heavy. It wasn't like the world had stopped, but more like something was missing. I shook it off, though. I was just being paranoid, I thought. The others were all having a good time, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. As the night wore on, we decided to head to bed. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, and we each took one. I ended up in the larger room at the front of the cabin, with a big window that faced the woods. The curtains were heavy, and I pulled them shut before lying down. The bed was comfortable enough, but the creaking of the old wooden frame kept me tossing and turning. I found myself staring out the window in the dark, the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Around midnight, I finally managed to drift off to sleep, but the peace didn't last long. I woke up to the sound of a loud thud. It was the kind of sound that made you sit up straight in bed, heart pounding. I froze, listening. The house was silent again. I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe an animal outside, or a branch hitting the roof. I tried to go back to sleep, but something was nagging at me. I kept hearing small noises, the kind you might ignore in a normal house, but in a place this isolated, they felt amplified. A few hours passed, and I finally fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The cabin was still cold, but the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale orange light over everything. I rubbed my eyes and sat up in bed, feeling groggy. I decided to head downstairs to make some coffee. Ben was already in the kitchen making breakfast. He looked tired, his face pale. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked, without looking up from the stove. I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't told anyone about the noises. but hearing him bring it up made me feel a little less crazy. Yeah, actually, a few weird sounds, like something bumping against the house. Ben nodded. Same here. I thought it was an animal, but I don't know. It didn't sound like that. We shrugged it off, though. It was probably just the house settling or an animal in the woods. Nothing to get worked up over. The day passed uneventfully. We went for a hike up the nearby trail, passing through dense forest, and even stumbled upon a small stream where we stopped for a bit. It was a beautiful spot, quiet and serene. We talked about everything and nothing, enjoying the simplicity of being away from the city. That night, we made a big dinner, grilled steaks and vegetables over the fire. The night sky was clear, and we spent a few hours sitting outside, watching the stars. But again, as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. It was like something was watching us, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. We all went to bed early that night, and I tried to sleep as quickly as I could. But it wasn't long before the noises started again. First, a small knock, then another thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The house felt too still, too quiet. I got up and went to check the windows. Nothing outside. No animals, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But I still couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I was being watched from the shadows of the trees, even though I knew that was impossible. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I found myself listening to the wind howling outside, wondering if it was just the trees causing the strange sounds. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time it was louder, and it definitely came from inside the house. I grabbed my flashlight and crept down the stairs. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but I didn't care. I had to know what was happening. The house was dark and still, and I moved through it cautiously, shining the light on everything. The kitchen was empty, the living room too. That's when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the sound, reaching the basement door at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering from below. I didn't want to go down there. I wanted to turn around, go back upstairs, and pretend this was all in my head. But my legs moved on their own, and I descended into the darkness. What I found in the basement was enough to make me freeze in terror. There, in the far corner of the basement, was a pile of old furniture. Broken chairs, dusty boxes, and an old wooden cabinet. And next to it, there was a trapdoor in the floor, half hidden by the furniture. The dragging noise had come from this door. Someone or something had been moving it. I don't know why, but I walked closer to it. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, my flashlight trembling in my grip. With one hard pull, the trapdoor creaked open. Underneath was a narrow, dark space, almost like a crawl space. And in the very center of it, there was something. A bundle, wrapped in a tattered sheet. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but when I shone the flashlight on it, my stomach dropped. It was a pile of old clothes, and under them there was something that looked like a bag. A human-sized bag. A bag that had been sitting there, hidden for who knows how long. I felt my body go numb, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. My mind was racing, and I had to force myself to think clearly. Someone had been down there. Someone had been hiding in the basement, and they had left whatever it was down there. I ran upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't even hear my own footsteps over the blood rushing in my ears. I reached my friends' rooms, waking them up, and we decided to leave. We packed our things in a hurry, not even bothering to lock the door behind us. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin. The lights were still on, the porch empty. I didn't know what had been hidden under that trapdoor, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't coming back. My name's Mason. Back in 2017, I was 28 years old and stuck in a rut I didn't see coming. I just quit my job in Boston. Some marketing gig that paid well but had me staring at screens for 12 hours a day. My girlfriend had left a few months earlier. Said I was distant. Said I was becoming someone she didn't recognize. She was right. That fall, I started to spiral. I drank more, slept during the day, ignored friends, ignored bills. When winter hit, I realized I needed to get out of the city, somewhere cold and quiet. Just me, no distractions. I found a place on an old forum. Somebody was renting out a remote cabin in northern Vermont for cheap. Guy said it had wood heat, a basic kitchen, no Wi-Fi, no cell reception. Sounded perfect. The drive took most of the day. Snow had started falling just north of Montpelier, and by the time I hit the turnoff near a town called Craftsbury, visibility was getting bad. The GPS on my old Subaru gave out 10 miles past the last gas station. I followed the directions I'd printed off, winding through back roads lined with leafless trees and snow-covered stone walls. Every few miles I passed an old barn or a rundown farmhouse, but mostly it was just woods. Dark, wet woods that closed in on both sides like a tunnel. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that curved downhill through a birch grove. It looked smaller than I'd expected, single-story, weathered cedar planks, a rusted metal chimney poking out from the roof. There was a small woodshed to the side and a frozen creek just down the slope. The place had a tilted porch with one broken step and a screen door hanging by one hinge. Inside, it was dark and cold. The front room was one big open space with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and an old couch that looked like it had seen better decades. A hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The air smelled like mildew and wood smoke. A few spider webs hung in the corners. I lit a fire first thing. Took forever to get going. The logs in the shed were damp and half-rotted, but after enough newspaper and frustration, the flames finally caught. I unpacked my gear, just a duffel bag with clothes, a box of canned food, a few bottles of water, and a flask I'd filled with bourbon for emergencies. I set up my laptop even though there was no Wi-Fi, just to journal or watch movies I downloaded. But mostly I planned to read, right? Maybe go hiking once the weather cleared. The first night was peaceful. I remember that. The fire popped quietly, and snow tapped at the windows like tiny fingers. It was the kind of quiet that made you realize how loud cities were. No cars, no people yelling, just wind and trees. I slept well under a pile of old quilts I found in the bedroom closet. But the peace didn't last. It started the second night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. Not a crash or bang, just this slow, rhythmic creaking, like someone walking in circles on the porch. I sat up, heart thudding, and held my breath. Kept going, a step every few seconds. Wood groaning under weight. It stopped after a minute. I figured maybe it was a deer, or the wind shifting the porch boards. Still, I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I saw footprints in the snow outside the front door. Human ones, boot prints. They circled the cabin once and disappeared back into the woods. They weren't mine. I'd stayed inside all day. They were spaced far apart, like the person was tall or walking fast. I told myself it was probably a local hunter. Maybe someone checking out the place, thinking it was empty. The guy I rented from hadn't mentioned neighbors, but I hadn't asked either. Still, the sight of those tracks, fresh and clear, made the skin on my neck prickle. I spent the day chopping some of the drier wood I found at the bottom of the stack. I tried to distract myself with reading, cooking, and writing nonsense in my journal. But every sound outside made me twitch. The wind in the trees, branches falling, snow shifting on the roof. I didn't sleep that night either. The third night, something woke me again. This time it was a scrape, like metal on wood. Came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. I sat up on the couch, where I'd been dozing with the fire dying out. The sound came again. Scrape, pause, scrape. I crept into the kitchen and looked out the back window. Nothing but darkness and trees. In the morning, I found more tracks. This time, they led from the creek up to the back of the house. Someone had walked right up to the rear wall and just stood there. No boot prints leading away, just a set of them straight to the wall and nothing else. I tried to convince myself they'd been covered by snowfall, but I knew better. The snow was light, barely an inch. No way it erased footprints that quickly. That afternoon, I dragged an old dresser in front of the back door. I wedged a chair under the knob for good measure. I didn't own a gun, but I did have a hunting knife and a hammer, which I kept near me at all times after that. I didn't want to leave early. I told myself I was overreacting, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the tracks. It was a feeling, like I was being watched. On the fourth night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire with the lights off, wrapped in a blanket, eyes on the windows. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement. Just a flicker, a shape moving past the front window. I froze, didn't breathe. A few seconds later, I heard a soft thud on the porch. Then that same creaking again. One step, pause, another step. Whoever it was stopped right in front of the door. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like an hour. Never moved, never blinked. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. In the morning, I found the snow on the porch disturbed, like someone had stood there a long time, shuffling their feet. The footprints led down the hill toward the trees. I followed them for about 50 feet before they disappeared into the underbrush. No sign of who made them. That day, I almost left. I packed my bag, threw everything into the car, and started it up. But the engine made a weird grinding noise and then died. I tried again. Nothing. Battery was fine. Fuel gauge said I had a quarter tank, but it wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood. Everything looked normal, but I'm no mechanic. I went back inside, heart sinking. I kept the fire going all day and tried not to panic. That night, I left the lights on. Every single one. I sat with the hammer in my lap, barely blinking. No movement, no sounds. But the next morning, I found something new. On the porch railing, someone had scratched a message into the wood. Just 2 words, "Stay inside." I stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking. I knew I had to leave. I didn't care if I had to hike out. I packed everything into my bag and started walking down the road toward where I came from. But after a mile or so, I saw something that made me stop. My tire tracks, the ones I'd made driving in, were gone. Covered, but not by snow. Someone had raked the snow smooth, like they didn't want anyone to find the cabin. I turned back. I didn't know what else to do. I was in the middle of nowhere with no phone, no working car, no idea who was out there. I figured it'd be safer to stay inside during the day and only hike out once I had a solid plan. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard banging at the back door. Not knocking, banging. Like someone slamming their fists into the wood over and over. The chair wedged under the knob held, but the whole door shook. I grabbed the hammer and stood there, heart racing, not breathing. After a minute, the banging stopped. Then I heard footsteps running around the side of the cabin. I sprinted to the front door just in time to see someone disappear into the woods. Tall, wearing dark clothes, moving fast. I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit down. I waited for daylight, then moved the dresser away, grabbed my pack, and started walking again. This time I followed the creek downstream, thinking it might lead to a road. It took me half the day, but eventually I came out near a dirt road with tire tracks. Real ones, fresh. I followed them until I saw a mailbox and an old farmhouse. The man who lived there called the sheriff for me. He was quiet, looked at me strange when I told him where I'd been, said that cabin hadn't been rented out in years. Said the owner, a guy named Harrow, had died 2 winters ago. The sheriff came, asked me a few questions, then drove me back to the cabin to check things out. It was empty, no footprints, no scratches on the railing, nothing disturbed, but my car still wouldn't start. Sheriff had it towed to town. Turns out someone had pulled out a few spark plug wires. Deliberately, they never found who did it. I didn't stay the night in town. I rented a car and drove straight back to Boston. That was 8 years ago. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't stepped foot in Vermont either. I think about it a lot, who was out there, why they didn't break in, what they meant by stay inside. I don't have answers. Just the memory of a cold, I was 32 when it happened, and I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. The memory always creeps back in when I'm alone in the woods or when I hear twigs snapping at night. It happened in early August 2019. I had taken a few weeks off work after finishing a long and stressful project. I needed a reset, no phone, no emails, no people. So I packed up my gear and drove up to a spot near Arrowhead Lake in Montana, a place I'd been to once before with a buddy 2 years earlier. It's not too popular, not too far off-grid, and there's a small Forest Service road that cuts through thick woods to a hidden clearing near the lake's edge. The road is bumpy, narrow, and barely maintained, but I liked that. Kept the crowds away. I planned to stay 4 nights. I had a big cooler of food, enough water, a good tent, tools, and my old 9mm pistol in the glove box, just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble. I just liked being prepared. I arrived around 4 p.m. that first day, set up my tent under the tall lodgepole pines, and spent the rest of the evening cooking a simple meal over the campfire. Everything felt calm. The woods were quiet, just the distant call of a hawk and the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. That first night was peaceful. I slept hard, the way you do after a long drive and fresh air. But the next day, things started to feel off, though I didn't realize it until later. I woke early before sunrise. The morning air was cool and damp, the grass wet with dew. I made coffee on my little camp stove and took a walk down to the lake with my mug in hand. There was a low fog hugging the water, and the trees looked like shadows behind it. I didn't see anyone else, which was normal for this spot. You usually don't run into other campers unless it's the weekend. After breakfast, I decided to hike a few miles up one of the unmarked trails behind my campsite. I wanted to scout out a good spot for wildlife watching later in the evening. I carried my day pack with water, some granola bars, and my hunting knife. Not because I was hunting, but because a blade is always useful in the woods. About 2 miles in, I found a ridge that looked out over a small valley. Perfect spot. I marked it on my GPS and turned back. That's when I noticed something strange. A tree near the trail had been carved. Just a small mark, nothing dramatic, but it wasn't natural. It was a thin vertical line about eye level, and below it, a sideways X. It looked fresh. No moss growing in the cut. No weathering. It didn't seem like much at the time. People leave weird signs in the woods sometimes. Could be anything, a hiker marking their path, or even just a bored kid. I didn't give it more thought than that. I got back to camp by early afternoon, ate lunch, read a bit, then hiked back out to the ridge for sunset. It was beautiful. The sky lit up in oranges and purples, and the valley below turned to shadow. I waited until twilight, hoping to spot deer or maybe even a bear in the distance, but nothing came. By the time I got back to camp, it was nearly dark. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. I couldn't figure out why at first. There were no strange noises, no light, nothing obvious. Just this tight feeling in my chest, like something was off. Around 2 a.m., I sat up and listened. Silence. No wind. No insects. Not even the distant hoot of an owl. The silence is what really got to me. Even in the woods, there's always some noise at night. Crickets, leaves rustling, something. But this was dead quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed up another hour just listening, my hand resting on my flashlight, my heart beating a little faster than I wanted to admit. Eventually, I laid back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. Near the edge of the clearing where I'd parked my truck, maybe 30 feet from my tent, there were fresh footprints in the soft dirt. Human, adult-sized. They weren't mine. I checked. I wear size 12 boots, and these were smaller, probably a size 9 or 10. And barefoot. The prints came from the woods, stopped near my tent, and then turned around. Just a single set, like someone had walked up quietly, stood there for a while, then slipped back into the forest. I stared at them for a long time. Then I checked my tent, my truck, my gear. Everything was untouched. My food was still there. Nothing missing. I couldn't figure it out. If it was someone trying to steal, why leave empty-handed? Why barefoot? I thought about packing up and leaving. I really did. But I convinced myself it was probably just a weirdo hiker. Maybe high, maybe lost, maybe harmless. I didn't want to overreact. I had driven 6 hours to get here, and I still had 2 nights left. I moved my cooler and food into the truck, locked the doors, and kept my pistol on me the rest of the day. That evening, I didn't hike. I stayed in camp, fire burning bright, just sitting, listening. I thought maybe I imagined the footprints, or they were older than I realized. Maybe it wasn't a person at all. Maybe I just needed more sleep. That night was worse. I lay in my tent with my ears open. I didn't sleep. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard something outside. Not close at first, just footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching dry leaves, getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on inside the tent, but I didn't unzip the door. I just sat still, listening. The steps circled the tent. Once, then again, a full circle. They stopped near the back of the tent. Nothing for a full minute. Then the zipper of the tent moved. Didn't open, just moved like someone touched it, tested it. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then footsteps again, slowly walking away into the trees. I sat there, frozen. I don't know how long I waited. At least an hour, maybe more. I didn't hear anything else. When the sky finally started to lighten, I got up, got dressed, and walked the entire camp perimeter. No sign of anyone, no more footprints, just silence. That was it for me. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything fast, shoved gear into bags without folding or sorting, and loaded the truck. By 8 a.m., I was ready to go. I sat in the driver's seat, keys in hand, when I noticed something small tucked under my wiper blade. It was a single Polaroid photo, blurry, crooked, but I knew what it was. It was a photo of me sitting by the campfire, taken from behind the trees. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. My face was in profile, the firelight on my cheek. I must have been reading. The photo was taken from about 20 feet away, and I never heard a sound. I didn't wait another second. I started the truck and backed out onto the Forest Service road, tires kicking up dust. The road is rough, full of rocks and roots, and I was bouncing so much I thought my gear would fly out the back. I didn't care. I just wanted distance. The drive back to civilization felt like forever. I kept checking the rear view, half expecting someone to follow me. But no one did. I made it to the nearest gas station around noon. I didn't say anything to the guy inside. I just used the bathroom, bought a sandwich, and got back in the truck. When I got home, I looked at the photo again. There was something else in it. In the shadows, behind the trees, barely visible, was a second figure. Hard to see, just a shape, a silhouette. Could have been anything, but I knew. I filed a report with the sheriff's office, told them everything, gave them the photo. They took it seriously, sent someone out to check the area, but I never heard back. A month later, I called to follow up. They told me they didn't find anything. No signs of other camps, no prints, no trash, nothing. The ranger who went out said it looked undisturbed, like no one had been there at all. I still think about that place. I still wonder who was out there, what they wanted, why they watched me, why they took a photo, and why there were two of them. But more than anything, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. It was early September of 2017 when I decided I needed a break from the city. I had just turned 31, and life had been pulling me in too many directions at once. I worked in insurance, mostly behind a desk, trapped under fluorescent lights, and answering calls from angry people who didn't read their policies. I had no family in the city, few friends, and the kind of persistent fatigue that builds up slowly over the years without you even realizing it. One morning, I stared at my face in the mirror, pale from the artificial light and lack of sun, and said to myself, I need out. So I booked a week off work, packed up my car with some basic gear, and drove north. I didn't have a solid plan, just a general direction. I ended up in northern Oregon, near the border with Washington. I'd found a place on an old backpacking forum, not an official campground, more of a local spot known among hikers and loners. It was called Seven Pines Ridge. The guy who posted about it said it was quiet, isolated, and beautiful. A ridge that ran along a forgotten section of forest just off an old logging road, with a small stream running through it. It sounded perfect. No people, no signal, and no noise. Took me nearly 5 hours to get there. I left Portland around 6 in the morning, took I-5 north, then veered off onto a bunch of state routes that twisted through small, almost forgotten towns. By the time I turned off the paved road onto the dirt track that led to the ridge, my GPS had stopped working. I didn't mind. That was kind of the point. The dirt road was rough. My old Subaru groaned over rocks and dipped into deep ruts, the kind that make your stomach rise just a bit if you go too fast. Trees pressed in from both sides. The forest felt old, damp, and undisturbed. I passed a rusted sign nailed to a post. Asterisk, 7 Pines Ridge Trailhead, no services. Asterisk, it was tilted. The lettering faded. I parked in a small clearing that barely fit my car, grabbed my backpack, and headed in on foot. The trail was narrow but visible. Moss covered almost everything, trees, rocks, even fallen logs. After about an hour of hiking, I found a flat patch near the stream, not far from the ridge's edge, where the trees thinned just enough to get a sliver of a view to the west. You could see rolling tree-covered hills that stretched out for miles. It was perfect. I set up my tent, built a small fire ring from nearby stones, and sat on a fallen log, just listening. No cars, no people, just wind in the branches and water trickling through roots and rocks. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some beans on my little camp stove, drank water from my filter bottle, and wrote in a small notebook. I slept surprisingly well. The air was cold, but fresh. I woke with the sun, sore from the ground, but clear-headed for the first time in months. The second day, I hiked further up the ridge. I didn't see a soul. There were no wrappers, no fire pits, no beer cans. Signs I'd come to expect even in untouched areas. This really was remote. I found some deer tracks near the stream and once saw what I thought might have been a coyote, but it darted away before I could get a good look. That night, I stayed up later. The stars were insane. No light pollution, just a sky bursting with pinpoints of white, a dome of silent infinity overhead. It was the third night when things started to feel off. It began with a sound. I just crawled into my sleeping bag. The fire had burned low, just red coals glowing faintly. I was halfway between sleep and wakefulness when I heard it. A snap, not a twig underfoot, not that sharp dry crack, but more like a dull pop, like a thick branch being twisted and broken. I sat up, listened. The forest was still, but not silent. Crickets chirped. Something small moved through leaves nearby, probably a squirrel. But then I heard another sound, closer this time. A slow crunching like footsteps, heavy, deliberate ones. Then silence. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer maybe, or an elk. But I'd grown up hiking in Montana. I knew the sound of animals moving through brush. These weren't quick, light, or erratic. They were slow and spaced like someone walking. I stayed still, hand resting on the knife by my pack. I didn't sleep much that night, just lay there, ears straining in the dark. Morning came and everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I walked the perimeter around my site, didn't find any footprints, but I did find something odd. A tree about 30 yards from my tent, freshly gouged with marks. Not scratches, not like claws, but long vertical lines that looked like they'd been made with a blade. Clean, deliberate cuts. 3 of them evenly spaced. I told myself it could have been old damage. I told myself I hadn't noticed it earlier. I went about my day as usual. Hiked some, collected wood, filtered more water. But I kept glancing at that tree. That night it rained. Not heavy, just a cold drizzle that crept into your clothes and stuck. I stayed in my tent, wrapped in my bag, reading a paperback. Around 1 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. This time, there was no wind to blame, no dry branches to snap in the breeze. The sound came from just beyond my tent, from the direction of the stream. It moved slowly, deliberately, circling wide. I lay frozen. My knife was under my pillow. I slid my hand toward it, heart hammering. Then I heard a low thud, like something being dropped, followed by silence. I didn't sleep. When the sky finally lightened, I stepped out. The drizzle had stopped. The forest smelled like wet leaves and earth. At the edge of the stream, I saw it, a pile of rocks, stacked deliberately, 5 of them, each one placed with precision like a little monument that hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. Now I started to feel genuinely unsettled. Someone was nearby. I packed my things fast, took down the tent, shoved everything into my backpack, and headed back down the trail. I figured I could make it to the car in under an hour if I moved fast. But about 15 minutes in, I stopped cold. There were boot prints in the mud, deep ones, fresh, leading toward my campsite. They weren't mine. I wear trail runners. These were heavier, like work boots, treaded, large, size 11, maybe 12. They weren't there when I came in. I felt like I was being watched. I started walking faster. Every sound behind me made my skin crawl. At one point, I even broke into a jog, heart pounding. When I finally reached the clearing, my car was there, untouched. No signs of anyone else. But I didn't feel safe until I was back on the paved road, reception bars lighting up on my phone. I drove to the nearest town, a place called Oak Hollow. Tiny. A single gas station, a diner, and a post office. I sat in the diner for an hour, just nursing coffee and staring at the table. My thoughts were racing. Was it a hunter? A drifter? Someone living off-grid? Why come so close to my tent? Why leave the rock pile? Eventually, I booked a room at a motel and stayed the night. I couldn't go back to the ridge, and I didn't want to go home yet either. I needed to clear my head. But the story doesn't end there. A week later, back in Portland, I kept thinking about it. I told myself I'd imagined things. Maybe I'd been on edge, sleep deprived, but I couldn't stop wondering. So I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went online and searched for Seven Pines Ridge. Not the hiking forum, I went deeper. Old news stories, obscure blogs, local reports. That's when I found it. An article from 2004, archived in a local newspaper. A missing hiker, a man named Greg Walters, 29. He'd gone missing near Seven Pines Ridge. His car was found at the same clearing I'd parked at. Search and rescue found his tent, undisturbed. His gear was still there, but he was gone, never found. There was another case, 2011. A woman, same spot. Her tent was slashed open. Her pack was found a mile away. She was later found wandering the forest, barefoot, incoherent. She'd refused to speak to authorities. Eventually ended up in a psychiatric facility. I felt sick. This wasn't just in my head. I never went back. I sold the camping gear, changed my car, moved to a different apartment. I don't even go to public parks anymore. I still think about that third night, the sound of the steps, the rock pile, the knife marks in the tree. Someone was there watching me, not trying to kill me, just watching, waiting. And that's what haunts me the most. It wasn't what happened. It's what could have happened if I had stayed one more night. My name's Trevor Doyle, and in the summer of 2019, I made the worst mistake of my life. I was 34 back then. I'd been living in Knoxville, Tennessee, working a desk job at a logistics company. The work wasn't bad, but after nearly 10 years in that same office, I was beginning to feel like my life was slowly turning into copy paper and coffee cups. I had this itch in my chest that I couldn't scratch, a feeling like something important was slipping away, like I'd blink and wake up at 60 with a gut full of regret. That's when I decided I needed a break. I had a decent bit of vacation time saved up, and I figured the best way to reset was to get outside. Just me, a backpack, and nature. I'd done some hiking and camping growing up, mostly with my dad in the Smokies, but nothing too intense. Still, I figured I could handle myself. I planned a 4-day solo camping trip along the less traveled stretches of the Cherokee National Forest, near the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. I spent weeks mapping out my route, buying gear, checking weather forecasts. I wasn't going off the grid completely, but I wanted real solitude. No crowds, no other hikers, just trees, dirt, and silence. I picked an area east of Tellico Plains, past a place called Indian Boundary. It was supposed to be quiet and remote, with dozens of old logging trails crisscrossing through the woods. A buddy of mine, an ex-Marine who knew the area, gave me some GPS coordinates to check out. He said there were these old fire roads out there, barely visible now, but perfect for getting off the main paths. I marked them down. I left on a Thursday morning in early August. Weather was hot, mid-80s during the day, dropping to the 60s at night. I had a 60-liter pack with food, water, a tent, stove, first aid kit, and a satellite beacon just in case things went south. I didn't plan on needing it, but it made me feel better. Day one was uneventful. I parked my car near a forestry service gate and hiked about 7 miles in before making camp beside a small creek. The bugs were bad, but the sound of running water made up for it. I cooked some rice and tuna, set up my tent, and watched the trees turn dark as the sun dropped below the hills. I slept well that night. On the second day, I followed a narrow, overgrown trail up through a ridge. It wasn't on any official maps, but it had a faint old marker nailed to a tree. Looked like a rusted U.S. Forest Service tag. I figured it was one of the old fire breaks my friend mentioned. It wasn't easy walking. The trail was littered with branches, thorn bushes, and rocks, and the slope was steeper than I expected. By noon, I was sweating through my shirt and swatting at flies like crazy. I stopped to rest on a flat section of the trail. There was an old tree stump there, hollowed out in the middle, probably from lightning or rot. I remember thinking it looked like something out of a horror movie, but I laughed it off. I took a long drink from my Nalgene and kept walking. About 4 hours later, the trail completely disappeared. It just ended. 1 second I was pushing through weeds and shrubs. The next I was standing in a thicket of saplings with no clear path ahead. I tried circling around, looking for signs of worn ground or broken branches, but it was useless. The trail had either faded with time or I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. I wasn't panicked, not yet. I had my GPS unit and I could always backtrack. So I pulled it out, flipped it on, and waited. Nothing. The screen stayed frozen on the boot up screen. I restarted it twice, changed the batteries, tried everything. Still nothing. That's when my stomach dropped a little. I didn't like relying on electronics, but I'd made the mistake of letting the GPS do most of the route tracking. I hadn't paid close attention to land features or compass bearings. And now I was at least 10 miles from the car, deep in the woods with no clear trail and a busted GPS. I sat down and ate a granola bar, trying to stay calm. I figured I'd retrace my steps. I'd just follow the ridge back down, find the creek from the first night, and go from there. I started back the way I came, or at least I thought I did. But the further I went, the less things looked familiar. The light was starting to fade through the trees, and everything took on that eerie blue glow that makes shadows look like people. After maybe an hour of walking, I saw something up ahead, a plastic bag caught on a branch. I recognized it immediately. It was the one I'd used to pack out trash from the night before. That meant I just walked in a big damn circle. Now I was scared. I didn't want to hike in the dark, so I set up camp where I stood. I found a small clearing, pitched the tent, and boiled some water for soup. I kept hearing noises in the brush around me. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. My mind was playing tricks. That night was rough. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something. Something too quiet to be an animal. More like movement. Slow, careful. Once I thought I heard breathing outside the tent. I held my breath for so long I got dizzy, but the noise faded. I didn't sleep more than 2 hours. In the morning, I packed up fast and started walking. I used the position of the sun to try heading west, where I knew the highway was. But the terrain was awful. No trails. Just thick brush, fallen logs, steep gullies. My arms and legs got shredded by thorns. My ankles ached from uneven ground. I fell at least 3 times, hard. Around noon, I stopped to check my map, which at this point felt almost useless. As I sat there, swatting flies and sweating through my clothes, I heard something behind me, a soft crunch. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing, just woods. But something had moved. I was sure of it. I picked up my pace after that. I was burning through water faster than expected, and my food supply wasn't built for this kind of detour. I only packed for 4 days, assuming I'd be back by Sunday. At some point in the late afternoon, I found something odd. An old hunting blind, rotted and half collapsed, about 6 feet off the ground in a dead tree. It looked ancient. I climbed up just to see if I could get a better view, maybe spot a road or a power line. What I saw instead made my blood turn cold. Far down the ridge, maybe 300 yards, was a small blue tarp, and next to it something else, a shape. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but it wasn't a rock. It was too smooth. I pulled out the monocular from my belt pouch and looked again. It was a backpack, and it wasn't mine. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if someone else had gotten lost out here too. Maybe they'd set up camp and bailed, or maybe they were still here. I decided to go check it out. It took me nearly 45 minutes to get down there through the mess of brush and broken trees. When I finally reached the tarp, my heart was thudding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The tarp was spread over a patch of mossy ground. Underneath it were empty food wrappers, a rusted cooking pot, and the backpack, which was open and half full of gear. Most of it was moldy or water damaged, but the really strange part was how old everything looked. The wrappers were for brands I hadn't seen since the early 2000s. The pot had a faded price sticker in a style I hadn't seen in years. And then I found the ID. It was in a Ziploc bag tucked into a side pocket. Tennessee driver's license. Name Michael S. Whitmore. Age 27. Expired in 2005. I sat there for a long time, staring at that ID. I remembered hearing that name before. I didn't know him, but I vaguely remembered something about a guy who went missing near here years ago. Hiker. Never found. I didn't know what to do. I didn't see any bones or remains, just the old gear. But it was clear he'd never made it out. Something had gone wrong. That night, I didn't camp. I kept walking. I didn't care about blisters or falling. I just kept going, pushing west, heart pounding every time a twig snapped or the wind moved wrong. I walked until my legs buckled and I collapsed against a tree. I dozed off there, sitting upright, jerking awake every 20 minutes. The next morning, I found a dirt road. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but no, it was real. An actual road. Narrow, overgrown, probably not used in years. But a road. I followed it for nearly 5 hours before I saw signs of life. A mailbox, a fence, then a trailer, sitting on cinder blocks, with a rusted pickup in the yard. No one was home, but the truck had a CB radio. I used it to call for help. 2 hours later, a forest ranger showed up. He looked at me like I was a ghost. They took me back to the ranger station, fed me and patched me up. I told them everything, including where I'd found the gear. They sent out a team a few days later and confirmed it, Michael Whitmore, officially missing for 14 years. They never found his remains. I don't know what happened to him. Maybe he fell, broke a leg, starved. Maybe he just got lost like me, but wasn't lucky enough to find a road. I haven't gone camping since. I still have the boots I wore out there. They sit in my garage, covered in mud I never washed off. Sometimes I still... I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A few days alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just quiet. That was the plan. I had rented the cabin from a small listing I found online. It was old, simple, and far from any major roads. It had been used mostly as a hunting cabin, according to the description. There was a single dirt path leading to it, barely wide enough for my truck. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive out took longer than expected. The last stretch was rough, the road uneven, potholes filled with water from recent rain. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself looked like something from an old photograph. Weathered wood, a small porch, and a tin roof. It stood alone, surrounded by thick forest. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I parked and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no noise except for the occasional rustling of leaves. No cars, no people, just silence. I liked it. The inside of the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a couch against the far wall. A door led to a tiny bedroom with a single bed, and there was a bathroom with an old shower that barely worked. It wasn't luxury, but it was what I needed. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, and started a fire in the old wood stove. The temperature had dropped fast, and the warmth was welcome. I made a quick meal, ate at the table, and then sat on the porch for a while, watching the woods darken. The trees were so thick that once the sun was gone, it felt like the world ended just beyond the cabin's small clearing. That night, I slept lightly. The bed was uncomfortable, and the wind outside made the trees creak. I woke up a few times, feeling like something had disturbed me, but there was nothing, just the silence pressing in. At some point, I fell into a deeper sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The fire had died, and the air inside was cold. I got up, stretched, and went outside to gather some firewood. The cabin had a small shed a few yards away, stocked with dry logs. As I walked over, I noticed something that made me stop. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the woods to the porch, stopping right at the front door. Then they turned and went back into the trees. They were deep, meaning whoever left them was heavy, maybe wearing boots. My own tracks from the day before were still visible, but these were new. I stood there, staring at them. It didn't make sense. No one should have been out here. I had heard nothing during the night. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick. It wasn't the kind of place you just wandered through by accident. I shook off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was probably an old hunter passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin, got curious, and left. That made sense. Still, I felt unsettled. I brought the firewood inside, lit the stove again, and made some coffee. The warmth helped, but the thought of those footprints stuck with me. I spent most of the day hiking around the area, exploring a little. The woods were dense, but I found an old overgrown trail that seemed to lead somewhere deeper. I followed it for a while before turning back, not wanting to go too far from the cabin. By the time I got back, the sun was already starting to set. I cooked a quick meal, ate, and then sat by the fire, listening to the wood crackle. Outside, the woods had gone silent again. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, it felt different, heavy, like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. That night, I woke up again, but this time I knew why. There was a sound outside. Slow, steady footsteps, moving around the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps weren't hurried, not like an animal moving through the underbrush. They were deliberate, careful. They stopped near the porch. Then silence. I reached for the flashlight next to my bed, gripping it tightly. I listened, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the silence was messing with my mind. But I knew that wasn't true. Someone had been outside. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I went outside immediately, scanning the ground. The footprints were there again, fresh. They circled the cabin this time. Whoever it was had walked around it, stopping at the windows, the door, watching. I decided to leave. Whatever peaceful trip I had planned was over. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my bag. I didn't bother with breakfast. As I loaded my things into the truck, I glanced back at the woods. Nothing moved, but I felt something there, watching. The drive back was tense. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I expected to see someone step out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching ahead. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. The silence of that forest, those slow, deliberate footsteps in the night, I couldn't shake it. I never went back to that cabin. I never even tried to find out who had been there. Some things, I think, are better left unknown. I always loved camping alone. There was something about the quiet of the woods, the isolation, and the simplicity of it all that made me feel at peace. I never worried about safety too much. Sure, I brought a knife and a first aid kit, but I never thought anything serious would happen. People go camping all the time. They hike, they set up their tents, they sit by the fire, and then they go home with nothing but sore legs and good memories. That was always my experience until one particular trip changed everything. I had taken a few days off work and wanted to get away from everything. No emails, no calls, no people. Just me and the wilderness. I found a remote camping area deep in the woods, far from any marked trails. It wasn't an official campground. It was just a place I had found after hours of looking at maps, an area that seemed untouched, perfect for some solitude. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, and my usual essentials. I even brought a small fishing rod, hoping to catch something fresh for dinner. The hike to the spot was long and tough. The terrain was uneven, and at times I had to push through thick undergrowth. But the effort was worth it. When I finally arrived, I found a small clearing near a slow-moving river. The trees around the clearing were tall and dense, blocking most of the wind. The river provided a steady sound of flowing water, which was oddly calming. It was perfect. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the water that I could hear it, but not so close that the ground was damp. I gathered some wood for a fire and got everything in order before the sun set. As the evening came, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. The air was crisp but not too cold. It was one of those nights where everything just felt right. I sat by the fire, eating and listening to the sounds of the forest. Occasionally, I would hear a branch snap in the distance or the rustling of leaves, but that was normal. Animals move around at night. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I had bear spray with me just in case, but I wasn't worried. I had camped enough times to know what to expect. After finishing my meal, I cleaned up and made sure all my food was secured away from my tent. Then, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep easily, the sounds of the river and the fire dying down lulling me into rest. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It was pitch black. My fire had gone out completely, and the only sound was the faint trickle of water from the river. I didn't know why I woke up, but something felt off. I lay still, listening, waiting. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the random noises of animals moving through the underbrush. These were slow, deliberate steps. They were close. Too close. I held my breath, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my position. I stayed still, listening, hoping that I was imagining it. Then the footsteps started again. They moved around the clearing, circling my tent. I gripped the knife I kept beside me, my fingers tightening around the handle. The footsteps stopped again, just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, steady breathing. Someone was standing right there. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Minutes passed, or maybe it was just seconds. Felt like forever. Then, just as quietly as they had come, the footsteps moved away. I listened as they faded into the woods until I could hear nothing but the river again. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was out there? A hunter? Another camper? But why would they come so close to my tent in the middle of the night without saying anything? When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent slowly and stepped outside. My fire pit was undisturbed. My gear was untouched. But when I looked around the clearing, I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Large, heavy prints that circled my tent, stopping just inches from where I had been sleeping. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I had planned to stay for a few more nights, but I wasn't going to risk another night out there. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. It wasn't until I was back in my car, doors locked, that I finally let out the breath I had been holding. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just another camper who didn't want to announce themselves. Maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I never went camping alone again. I had been working too much, too many hours behind the desk, eyes glued to screens, forgetting to eat, forgetting to rest, forgetting how to be anything but a machine. It hit me when I caught my reflection in a window and didn't recognize the man looking back. I looked pale and stretched thin, like a worn-out version of myself. That same night, I booked a week away in a cabin I found online. No phone reception, no internet, nothing but trees and silence for miles around. I wanted it that way. I told a few people where I'd be, set up an out-of-office message, packed up enough food, water, and firewood to last, and headed out early on a Monday morning. The drive up was long and winding. The further I got from the highway, the narrower the roads became, until I was just following a gravel path deep into a forest with no signs, no other cars, no people. I liked that at first. Felt like stepping out of time. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the photos. One room, more or less, with a bathroom attached, a basic kitchen, and a fireplace in the middle of the main room. There was a porch, too, overlooking a slope that dipped into the woods. It was early fall, and the leaves had already begun to change. Reds, oranges, and yellows scattered through the green. I spent the first day unloading, stacking firewood near the door, and checking everything inside. The water ran fine. The small propane stove worked. There was a backup generator in a shed out back, just in case, and a few lanterns and flashlights inside. No signal as promised. I turned my phone off and left it in my bag. I didn't want it. The quiet hit me that night. I'd forgotten how loud silence can feel. Every small creak of the walls or groan of the wind through the trees sounded magnified. It took a while to get used to it, but I eventually fell asleep by the fire. The second day I hiked around. There were no trails, but the woods were dense enough that I had to move slowly, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. I saw animal tracks in the mud near a stream and found a few half-collapsed hunting blinds that looked decades old. I didn't go too far, just enough to get a sense of the area. The cabin stayed in sight most of the time. I didn't want to risk getting lost. When I got back, I cooked some pasta and read a paperback I'd brought along until the sun dipped low. That night was harder. I woke up to something tapping. Not constant, not loud. Just an occasional tick or knock somewhere near the porch. I sat up and waited, heart pounding, listening. It stopped, then started again, slower, softer. I told myself it was probably a branch or an animal, maybe something in the wind. Still, I got up and looked out the front window. The porch was empty. Nothing moved in the trees. I didn't see anything strange, but that didn't help me fall back asleep. I stayed up for hours, sitting by the fire, staring at the door. The next day, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was still adjusting to the isolation. I had nothing to do but think, and my brain wasn't used to that. I kept busy, chopped some wood, organized supplies, walked the perimeter of the clearing around the cabin. But I noticed something then. Faint tracks in the dry grass, like someone had walked through it recently. I crouched down and saw the flattened grass, the light prints in the dirt. They were too large for most animals I knew. Not deep enough for a boot, but definitely shaped like a foot. I looked around, listening. The air was still, not even birds. I stood up and slowly backed toward the cabin, glancing over my shoulder the whole way. That night, I locked the door. I hadn't locked it the first 2 nights. The woods had felt safe until then. I even pushed the small table in front of the door. Not that it would stop anyone, but it made me feel better. I kept the fire low and stayed wrapped in my sleeping bag on the floor, staring at the ceiling, listening for the tapping. Came again, but not on the porch this time. It sounded like it came from the side of the cabin, just outside the kitchen window. A slow, deliberate tap, like a finger knocking on glass. I didn't move. I just lay there, barely breathing. Another tap, then nothing. At dawn, I went outside, heart pounding, and checked the area. No prints, no marks, nothing by the window. I walked all around the cabin, checked the tree line, even circled the shed near the back. I kept expecting to see someone. I never did. I stayed inside most of that day, keeping the fire going, trying to write something in a journal I'd brought. But my mind was scattered. I couldn't focus. Every time a twig snapped outside or the wind shifted, I froze. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something new. A smell, faint but distinct, coming from near the shed. It smelled like sweat, rust, and old meat. I hesitated, then grabbed the flashlight and walked out to the shed. The door was shut, the padlock still looped through the latch. I hadn't opened it since the first day when I checked the generator. I unlocked it and pulled the door wide. Nothing inside had changed. Generator, gas, and some extra tools. But the smell was stronger in there. I checked every corner, every shelf. Nothing. No blood, no animal, no sign of anything that could explain it. I locked it again and went back inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire with the poker in my hand, listening. No taps this time. No sounds at all, actually. Just a deep, heavy quiet that felt unnatural. Sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, crunching ones moving around the side of the cabin. I held my breath. They paused outside the window near the fire, then moved on, circling. I stayed completely still. Then the footsteps stopped. After what felt like an hour, I crept toward the window, crouched low, and peeked outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty. I waited until the sun came up before moving again. The next morning, I walked out to the edge of the woods. The leaves were disturbed in a few places. I followed a faint trail of movement, bending branches, scuffed dirt, curved through the trees, then vanished. No tracks, no obvious footprints, just a path that didn't look natural. I turned around, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement near the cabin, like someone slipping behind it. I ran back, heart thudding. I circled it 3 times, calling out once without even realizing it. Nobody was there. Inside, I checked my bags. Everything was in place. Nothing was stolen. I didn't understand it. That evening, I made a decision. I would leave the next day, 2 days earlier than planned. I didn't care about losing money. Something didn't feel right, and I wasn't going to push my luck. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I stayed in the dark with my flashlight off, wrapped in my coat, sitting on the floor with the poker beside me. At some point, I must have nodded off. I woke to the sound of the back door rattling. I had forgotten there was a back door, one that led out from the bathroom. I had never used it. I grabbed the flashlight and crept over. The handle was jiggling, slow and careful, like someone testing it. I held my breath, staring at the lock. It held. Then silence. I waited. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the front, like someone had thrown their weight against the main door. I spun around, heart racing, and ran to it. The table had tipped over. The door held, barely. I backed away, holding the poker in both hands. I heard footsteps retreating, running now. I stood there for hours, not moving. At dawn, I packed everything, shoved it into the car, and drove out without eating or even brushing my teeth. I kept looking in the rearview mirror the whole way down the gravel road. It took hours to get back to a real road. When I finally had signal, I pulled over and called a friend, told him I'd be home early, didn't explain why. When I got home, I checked the local news. There was nothing. No reports, no missing persons, no escaped criminals. I checked again the next day and the next. Nothing ever came up. I thought about going to the police, but what would I say? That someone walked around a cabin in the woods? That I heard noises? Saw a path? I didn't have proof. I didn't even have a clear description of anyone. Just a feeling that someone had been watching me, waiting, testing. I haven't gone camping since. I think about it sometimes. Not the cabin itself, but the quiet. The kind of silence that lets other things creep in. Things you don't hear in the city. Things that don't need to break in to get inside your head. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I stayed the full week. If I hadn't locked the door. If I'd opened it when I first heard the tapping. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know they were real. And I know they'll be back, eventually, for someone else who wants to get away for a while. Someone who thinks the quiet is peaceful. I used to think that too. Not anymore. I needed to get away from everything for a while. Work had been driving me crazy, and city noise never gave my mind any rest. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just quiet. A cabin deep in the woods sounded right. I didn't care about cell service or Wi-Fi. In fact, I wanted the opposite. I found a listing on a website for off-grid rentals. It was a small, one-room cabin in the middle of nowhere. No power, no running water, just a bed, a wood stove, and 4 walls. The pictures showed nothing but trees in every direction. That's what sold me. I packed my truck with a cooler full of food, a camp stove, a hatchet, a tarp, sleeping bag, water jugs, and a few other things I thought I'd need. I brought a small hunting knife too, just in case. I wasn't going out there to hunt, but I liked knowing I had something sharp on me. The drive took most of the day. Paved roads turned into gravel, then dirt, then a trail barely wide enough for my truck. I kept looking at the directions the owner had sent me, double-checking every landmark, because it was easy to feel lost out there. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dropping low behind the trees. It wasn't much to look at, just a square wooden structure, gray from sun and rain, with a small porch and a crooked step. A tiny outhouse stood about 20 feet away through the trees. There was a fire ring out front and a small pile of split wood under a tarp. That was about it, but it was quiet. No traffic, no sirens, not even birds. Just wind moving through the branches. Inside, the cabin was simple. A narrow bed along one wall, a chair, and a table. There was an old lantern hanging from a hook and a heavy wood stove in the corner. I opened all the windows to let the musty air out, then carried in my stuff from the truck. I lit a small fire in the stove even though it wasn't cold yet, just to get rid of the dampness. I made a quick meal, sat on the porch while I ate, then went back inside and unrolled my sleeping bag. That first night, I slept pretty well. The woods were dead silent, and once the fire burned low, the darkness wrapped around the cabin like a blanket. It was the kind of dark you don't get in cities. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The next morning, I woke up early. I made coffee on my camp stove, ate a couple granola bars, and took a walk down a nearby trail. I brought my hatchet in case I wanted to cut kindling. The woods were beautiful, thick pine and hardwoods, mossy ground, fallen logs. No signs of people. I didn't hear anything but the occasional rustle of something small moving through the brush. I walked for about an hour before looping back to the cabin. That afternoon, I chopped some more wood, swept out the cabin, and just sat on the porch listening. The wind had picked up, and the trees creaked against each other. It was peaceful, but by sundown, I started feeling this weird tightness in my stomach. It didn't make sense, I was fine all day. But once the light started to go, I kept looking over my shoulder. I brushed it off as nerves. Maybe I wasn't used to the total silence. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing faint noises outside. Little clicks and snaps. I figured it was raccoons or squirrels. At one point, something thumped against the side of the cabin. Just once. Not hard. Not like someone slamming into it. More like something brushing past. Still, I sat up in bed and listened. Nothing after that. I stayed awake until my eyes burned. By the third day, the peacefulness I came for was wearing thin. I was tired, on edge. I told myself it was just the adjustment. I hadn't spent this much time alone in years. I went on a longer hike that day, partly to keep myself moving, partly to get away from the tight feeling that clung to me in the cabin. I didn't see another soul out there, just trees, trees, and more trees. When I came back that afternoon, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. One of the wood piles had been knocked over. It wasn't windy that day. No storms, no animals big enough to scatter logs like that. I stood there staring at the mess, my heart beating faster. I looked around, scanning the woods. Nothing moved, but the air felt different. Tense, like it was holding its breath. I slowly stepped onto the porch, unlocked the door, and went inside. Nothing looked touched in the cabin, but I grabbed my knife from my bag and kept it nearby. I told myself I probably stacked the wood badly. Maybe a squirrel got into it. But I didn't believe that. I barely slept that night. I stayed under my sleeping bag, eyes open, watching shadows crawl across the ceiling. I kept the fire low so I could hear better. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Not animal footsteps, heavy, slow steps, like someone walking around the cabin. They stopped right outside the wall by the bed. I held my breath and gripped the knife so hard my hand hurt. I didn't move. The steps didn't come closer. They didn't move away either. They just stopped. I lay there like that for what felt like an hour. Then finally, I heard them walk off into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I wanted to leave. Every part of me said to get in the truck and go. But I couldn't shake the idea that whoever or whatever was out there might be waiting. My tires were already half sunk into the dirt and pine needles. If I left in a panic and got stuck, I'd be worse off. So I waited until the sun was high, then packed up slowly. Every time I stepped outside, I kept my knife in hand. I walked around the cabin once before leaving. That's when I found something that nearly made me throw up. Behind the outhouse, pressed into the soft dirt, were bare footprints. Not animal prints, not boots, human feet, big, wide, dirty, barefoot prints. The tracks went around the side of the cabin, stopped under the window by the bed, then disappeared into the woods. I knew then that someone had been out there watching me. They were watching me while I slept, maybe even before that, maybe since I arrived. I got in the truck and drove. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit paved road again. I didn't report it because what would I say? That someone knocked over my woodpile and left footprints? That I heard footsteps? There was no proof. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. When I got back to town, I took 2 showers and sat in silence for hours. I couldn't stop seeing the prints in my head. Couldn't stop hearing those footsteps. I don't go camping anymore. I don't stay in isolated places. People talk about wanting peace and quiet. I used to be one of them, but there's a kind of quiet that's too deep, too empty. A kind of quiet where you realize just how far you are from help. I learned something out there, something I didn't want to know. You're never really alone. And sometimes, the worst thing in the woods isn't a bear or a storm or even getting lost. It's another person, one who doesn't want to be found. I needed a break from people. Work had worn me down. My phone never stopped ringing. Deadlines, meetings, emails, and coworkers needing answers to things they could figure out themselves if they just tried. I wasn't angry, just worn out. I felt like I hadn't been alone in months. So when a buddy I used to work with mentioned an old cabin he and his brother had bought deep in the woods of northern Maine, I saw a way out. He said it hadn't been used in years, but it still stood, still had a roof, still had walls and a working door. That was enough for me. I packed my bag with the basics: flashlights, batteries, clothes, matches, a knife, a tarp, a blanket, a sleeping bag, and food that didn't need to be cooked. I wanted quiet. No Wi-Fi, no cell reception, just trees, wind, and the sound of my own breathing. It was a long drive. The roads got narrower, the trees taller, the houses fewer. Eventually, I was following an old dirt path my friend had marked out on a hand-drawn map. I remember thinking how easy it would be to miss the turnoff. There were no signs, no road markers. I had to slow the car down to a crawl, checking the trees for the notched marks he said they'd carved years ago. The final stretch wasn't even a road, just 2 tire ruts through tall grass and dirt that led up a slight hill. Felt like I was driving into nowhere. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Just 1 room with a front porch and a slanted tin roof. No electricity, no plumbing. There was an old iron stove in the corner, rusted but intact. A wooden table with 2 chairs, one of them broken. A metal-framed bed with a thin, musty mattress I didn't plan to sleep on. The windows were small and coated in grime. It looked like no one had stepped inside in a decade. Still, it was exactly what I needed. I spent the first few hours cleaning up, sweeping out old leaves and dust, airing out the inside, checking for any signs of animal activity. There were a few mouse droppings in one corner and a large hornet's nest above the front door, but nothing I couldn't handle. I set up my sleeping bag in the cleanest spot on the floor and placed my gear nearby. I liked how quiet it was. No hum of traffic, no voices, just wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of wood. I thought I'd sleep like a baby. That first night, I kept waking up. At first, I thought it was just the new setting. It was cold, the floor was hard, and I kept hearing things. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, distant crunching like footsteps, but not close enough to make me worry. Animals, I figured. A deer, maybe. A raccoon. The wind played tricks too, making it sound like movement where there was none. I told myself not to panic. This is what I came for. I wasn't scared, just alert. But by the second night, I started noticing patterns. The noises always came from the same side of the cabin. The left side, where the ground sloped down into thicker trees and brush. Around midnight, give or take, the crunching would start. Not fast or random, but steady. One step, then another. Pause, then another step. It would get closer, then stop. Every time I reached for the flashlight and looked out the window, there was nothing. Just dark trees. No eyes glowing back. No shapes moving. But I could still feel something out there, watching. On the third night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed up, sitting near the window with my flashlight and knife. I knew how that sounded, like I was going crazy, but I didn't care. I needed to see what was making those sounds. Around midnight, it started again. Crunch, pause, crunch, crunch. It was closer than before. I turned off the flashlight and crouched by the window, peering out through a crack in the wood. I stayed perfectly still. The moon was out, but not full. Just enough light to see shapes, not details. That's when I saw it. A figure standing still at the edge of the trees. Not moving, not swaying like trees did. Just there. It was too dark to make out features, but it looked like a person. Not hunched like an animal. Not walking, just standing, facing the cabin. I froze. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. I stared for what felt like an hour. I didn't move, neither did it. Then, slowly, it turned and walked back into the woods. I stayed awake till sunrise, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe a tree that looked like a person in the right shadow. But I couldn't shake the feeling it knew I was there, that it had come there to see me. I almost packed my stuff right then. But I told myself not to be stupid. I'd driven 9 hours to get here. I told people I wouldn't have cell service. No one would check on me for days. If I panicked and left now, I'd never forgive myself for being that kind of paranoid idiot. So I stayed, but I started marking the times, writing down when I heard things, where the noises came from, which window I looked out of. It helped me stay focused, made me feel like I was doing something about it. The fourth night came. I waited again by the window. The same time, the same sound. This time, the figure was closer. 10 steps from the cabin. Still not moving. Still just watching. I held the flashlight in one hand, the knife in the other. I knew if I turned the light on, I'd see it clearly. But I was afraid it might move. Or run. Or come toward me. I didn't turn it on. The next morning, I walked out to where it had stood. The ground was damp from the night air, soft enough to hold impressions. I looked for prints, anything, but there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been there. I tried to laugh it off, but it didn't work. I was too on edge. The fifth night, I barricaded the door. I moved the table in front of it, wedged a chair under the handle. I didn't care if it made me feel crazy. I needed to feel like I had some control. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner with my flashlight off, listening. This time, I didn't hear just footsteps. I heard breathing. It was faint, slow, but steady, like someone was standing right outside the wall. I held my breath and listened, trying to convince myself it was just wind in the trees. But the sound didn't move. It didn't come and go. It stayed, right outside. I sat there for what felt like hours. Eventually, it faded. I never heard footsteps leaving, just silence again. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I didn't care how it looked. I needed to leave. I started packing before the sun came up. I didn't eat, I didn't shower. I stuffed everything into my bag, yanked the chair from the door, and bolted. I didn't even check the outside. I just got in the car, started it, and drove. Fast. I hit the tire ruts too hard and nearly lost control, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway. I didn't tell anyone the full story. I said I just got bored and came back early. I didn't want people to think I'd lost it, but I knew what I saw, what I heard. That cabin wasn't just some abandoned place in the woods. Someone knew I was there. Someone was watching. I don't know if it was a local or just some stranger passing through, but whoever it was, they didn't make themselves known in the open. They didn't knock on the door or call out. They just watched, night after night, closer each time. A few weeks later, I had the thought to check online. I searched the area around the cabin, looked up news stories, crime reports. There wasn't much, but I did find something strange. An old forum thread from years ago where someone mentioned a similar cabin out that way. They said they'd gone out there to camp, that they'd felt watched the whole time, that they'd heard footsteps at night. They said they saw someone outside, just watching, and they'd left early too. The post had no replies, no follow-up, just that one story, like a warning, left for anyone who stumbled across it. I haven't gone camping since. I haven't spent another night in the woods, and I never asked my friend if he'd been out to the cabin lately. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night and everything's quiet, I hear it again. The breathing. Slow, steady, close, too close. I had been working from home for over a year, and even though I was grateful for the flexibility, the walls of my apartment had started to feel like they were closing in on me. Everything felt repetitive. Same breakfast, same desk, same view out the window. I'd stopped sleeping well. My back hurt from the cheap chair I kept promising to replace, and I hadn't had a proper break since last summer. I figured a change of scenery would help. Not a vacation at some crowded resort, just somewhere quiet where I could breathe and maybe write for myself again. Something I hadn't done in years. I used to write short stories in my free time, but the habit died when work and real life started eating up every hour. I found a cabin listed online. It was old, small, and sitting on a piece of land tucked away in the middle of nowhere, just woods for miles. It had a generator, a fireplace, and a hand pump for water. No internet, no cell service. The pictures showed peeling paint, warped wood, and a sagging roof, but I didn't care. It looked peaceful. It looked forgotten. It was early September when I made the drive out. The road narrowed the farther I went, until it was more gravel than asphalt. I passed maybe 3 houses in the last 20 miles, and by the time I pulled up to the property, I hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour. The cabin was smaller than I expected, almost like a tool shed with windows. The trees had grown thick and wild around it. Tall pines loomed on all sides, and the forest floor was littered with old needles and fallen branches. The path to the door was barely there, just patches of dirt packed down from years of wear. No one had been here in a long time. Took a minute to figure out the lock. The key was bent and stiff in the old metal, but I finally got it open and stepped inside. The air smelled like damp wood and dust. There was one main room, a tiny kitchen area against the wall, and a small bed in the corner with a mattress that looked like it hadn't been slept on since the 90s. A heavy trunk sat at the foot of the bed, and there was an old armchair by the window with stuffing poking out the side. The floor creaked under my feet like the boards were tired of being walked on. I unpacked my things, set my notebooks and laptop on the small table by the window, and opened all the shutters to let in the daylight. There was something comforting about being surrounded by nothing but trees. Felt like I could finally hear my own thoughts again. That first night, I built a fire in the fireplace even though it wasn't cold enough for it yet. The sound of the flames crackling was the only noise in the entire world. It was exactly what I needed. The second day, I walked around the property. The forest was thick and tangled, but not dangerous. I didn't go far, just enough to get a sense of the place. I found a rusted-out shed deeper in the trees with nothing inside but some old tools and a cracked lantern. A stack of rotting wood leaned against the back wall, and spiderwebs hung from the ceiling in thick drapes. I left it alone and went back to the cabin. By the third day, I started writing again. Not just notes or ideas, but actual pages. I lost hours at the little table, scribbling by hand because it felt better than typing. I'd go for short walks in the afternoon, cook simple meals on the old stovetop, and fall asleep early. The quiet was doing something to me, loosening something in my chest that had been knotted up for months. Then things changed. The first strange thing I noticed was a scratch on the door. It wasn't deep, just a thin gouge running across the bottom of the wood like something had dragged a nail or claw across it. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it had always been there, or maybe a raccoon or something had come sniffing around during the night. Still, I found myself checking the door more often, as if I expected something else to be there. That night, I had trouble sleeping. It was the first time since I arrived that the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy. I kept waking up thinking I'd heard something outside. Branches snapping, leaves crunching. But when I sat up and looked out the window, I couldn't see anything. Just black trees swaying in the dark. The next morning, there were more scratches on the door. They were higher this time, maybe waist level. Not deep, but deliberate. I stood there for a long time just looking at them, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like an animal. The marks were too clean, straight, like someone had used a knife or a sharp stick. But why? There was no one around for miles. I circled the cabin, looking for tracks or footprints, but the ground was too hard, and the pine needles covered everything. Still, I felt watched. Couldn't shake it. It felt like there were eyes on me from the trees, but no matter how hard I stared, I never saw anything move. I didn't write that day. I tried to, but I couldn't focus. I kept checking the windows, walking in circles inside the cabin. Every little creak made my heart jump. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something was off. The cabin wasn't just old. It felt like it didn't want me there anymore. That night, I left the lantern on beside the bed. I'd been using candles mostly, but the soft hiss of the lantern made me feel less alone. I stayed awake long after midnight, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of the doorknob turning. I froze. I didn't breathe. It was slow, careful, not like someone fumbling, like someone trying not to make noise. The latch didn't catch, but I heard it, metal scraping, the faint rattle of pressure. Then silence. I sat there in the dark, clutching the blanket like it could protect me from whatever was outside. I didn't have a weapon. There was a heavy flashlight on the table and a kitchen knife in the drawer, but that was it. I waited for hours, too scared to move, until the first light started to break through the trees. When I finally opened the door, there was nothing there. No one, but the scratches were back. More of them now, crisscrossing the wood like a message I couldn't understand. I wanted to leave. Every part of me was telling me to pack up and drive home, but something else kept me there. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to admit that a few weird marks and a bad night could ruin this retreat I'd built up in my head. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just one. Then I'd go home. That day, I walked farther than I had before. I needed to clear my head. The forest was thick and still, and the sunlight barely reached the floor through the high canopy. I followed a slope down to a small stream and sat there for a while, listening to the water. For a few minutes, the fear faded. I almost felt normal again. I turned back after an hour, but the return path felt different. I kept thinking I heard someone walking behind me, but when I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it started again. I never saw anything, but I started walking faster, then faster still. By the time I saw the roof of the cabin through the trees, I was nearly running. That night, I locked the door, jammed the trunk in front of it, and kept the flashlight in my hand as I sat on the bed. I didn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something outside again. Footsteps this time, slow, crunching the needles, coming from the trees. They stopped just outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The lantern was off, and I was hidden in the dark. I could hear breathing, slow, shallow, just outside the glass. I stayed frozen like that for what felt like forever, until finally the sound faded, and the woods were silent again. The first light, I packed everything. I didn't even eat. I threw everything in the car and didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Even then, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees. I didn't report anything. What would I say? That someone might have been scratching my door and breathing outside my window? There were no threats, no damage, just fear. Back home, I tried to move on. I told myself I imagined it, that isolation and stress had played tricks on my mind. But I still can't sleep with the windows open. I still wake up some nights thinking I hear something outside, something slow and deliberate. And last week, I got a package in the mail. No return address, just a wooden stick, sharpened at the end, with thin scratches carved into the side, almost like tallies, almost like someone keeping count. I threw it away, but I haven't slept since. I don't think it was just some stranger in the woods. I think someone lives out there, watching, waiting, not hunting animals, but people who wander too far into their quiet little world. And I think I almost became one of them. I didn't want to be there in the first place. That cabin wasn't my idea. It was my brother's. He thought it would be a good break, a quiet escape from work and stress and city noise. I hadn't taken time off in a while, and I guess I let him talk me into it. He found the place through someone he worked with, a little wooden cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine, right on the edge of a lake that never really got busy even in summer. It was late October when we went. The trees were already bare, and the sky felt lower than usual, hanging gray and quiet over the treetops. I remember the drive there more than I probably should. The road narrowed into a cracked, leaf-covered path the deeper we went into the woods. I kept checking the GPS, and the signal kept dropping in and out. It felt like we were sliding off the edge of the map. The cabin looked like it hadn't been used in years. It wasn't run down, just stale. Dusty windows, a pile of old firewood stacked by the door, a padlock that looked like it belonged on a shed more than a home. We used the key the owner gave my brother, and the door creaked open into a single open room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen area, and a narrow hallway that led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. It wasn't cozy, not really, but it was private, quiet, surrounded by trees thick enough to muffle the sound of wind. The first 2 days were uneventful. We read, we hiked a little, we fished off the dock that stuck out into the lake like a finger pointing at the middle of nowhere. It got cold fast after the sun dropped. We didn't have any cell service, but we brought a small radio and a stack of old books. I tried to enjoy it. I really did, but there was something off about the place. Not haunted or cursed or anything dramatic like that. It just didn't feel right. I'd lie in bed at night and stare at the wooden beams overhead, listening. Not to anything specific, just listening. The forest was always making noise. Branches popping, squirrels or raccoons rustling leaves. But I'd wake up sometimes because something had shifted, something tiny, like the air itself felt heavier. On the 3rd day, my brother decided to hike around the far end of the lake. He wanted to find a trail he saw on an old map the cabin owner left in the kitchen drawer. I stayed behind. I wasn't in the mood to walk another 6 miles through wet leaves and soggy paths. I told him to be back by dark. He laughed, said he would. Then he left with a small pack, a water bottle, and one of our flashlights. It was around noon. By sunset, he wasn't back. It got dark quick that night. I made a small fire in the stove, boiled water for coffee, and kept glancing out the windows. There were no lights out there. No houses, no cars, not even stars. Just black trees and darker sky. I waited until about 9 before I started getting really anxious. I kept telling myself he got turned around. Maybe the trail was harder to follow than he expected. Maybe he twisted an ankle and had to move slower. Maybe he was just being stubborn. I went out on the porch with another flashlight and called his name into the trees. There was no answer, just the crackle of leaves and the whisper of the lake pushing against the shore. I stayed up all night. The wind picked up around midnight, and the temperature dropped below freezing. I sat in the chair by the stove, wrapped in a blanket, flashlight in my lap, jumping at every creak and groan the cabin made. I was sure he'd knock on the door at some point, smiling like nothing was wrong, but he didn't. At first light, I packed a small bag, took our last working flashlight, and went out to follow the trail around the lake. The air was bitter cold. Frost coated everything, even the tips of the tall grass by the edge of the water. The path was barely there, just a narrow strip where the undergrowth wasn't as thick. I walked for over an hour, calling his name every few minutes. There was no sign of him, no boot prints, no broken branches, nothing. The trail curved away from the water and dipped into a thicker part of the woods. The trees grew closer together here. Less light made it through. It was quiet, too quiet. I started noticing strange things, not threatening, just odd. A tree stripped of bark in a perfect ring, almost like someone had shaved it down with a knife. A set of scratches in the dirt, not deep, but long and evenly spaced. Then I found the water bottle, my brother's water bottle. It was lying in a patch of moss, half buried like it had been dropped and kicked. I picked it up. It was still cold. I kept going. Then I found something worse. About 100 feet from the water bottle, just off the trail, there was a piece of blue fabric snagged on a bush. I recognized it. It was part of the jacket he wore. I felt my stomach twist. The branch it was caught on was snapped, bent outward like something had pushed through in a hurry. I started calling his name louder now, panic rising in my throat. I stepped off the trail and moved deeper into the trees, sweeping the flashlight across the ground, hoping to catch sight of his boots or his pack or anything. I found more scraps. A torn glove, the broken strap from his backpack, a crushed granola bar still in its wrapper. It looked like someone or something had ripped the bag open and thrown it aside. That's when I noticed how quiet everything had become. No birds, no rustling, just dead air and my own breathing. Then I saw the tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like boot prints, but wrong. Too deep, too far apart. Like someone with long legs had been running through the trees. I followed them without thinking. My heart was hammering. My hands were freezing. I stumbled over roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. The tracks led into a clearing I hadn't seen on the map. In the middle of it was a second cabin. It was smaller than ours, older. The windows were boarded up from the inside, but the door was slightly ajar. My first thought was maybe he found shelter here. Maybe he was inside, hurt, waiting for help. I approached slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it was pitch black. I stepped in, swept the flashlight around. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, like the door had been left open for a long time. There was a smell, something rotten but faint like old meat. There were empty cans stacked in a corner, wrappers, bones. Not animal bones. I didn't look too closely. There was a mattress on the floor, stained and sagging. No furniture, no pictures, just that stinking mess and the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. I called his name once, softly. Nothing. I backed out slowly, heart in my throat. I followed the tracks away from the cabin, hoping they'd lead me somewhere else. But they didn't. They just kept going deeper into the woods, weaving and doubling back in weird patterns. I started to feel dizzy, disoriented. The trees all looked the same. I couldn't hear the lake anymore. Then I heard something else. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't an animal. It was a soft, dry crunching, like someone slowly stepping on leaves, just out of sight. I froze. My flashlight flickered. I spun around, trying to find the source. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Then I saw movement, brief, fast, low to the ground. I started backing up. I didn't know what I was doing, just trying to get away from whatever it was. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. I tripped, fell, hit my knee on a rock so hard I couldn't stand for a minute. I crawled behind a tree and turned off the flashlight. I waited. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. When I turned the light back on, I was alone. I found the lake again just before sunset. I followed the shore until I saw the dock, then the cabin. My legs were shaking. I went inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep. The next morning, I left. I packed everything I could carry, left a note on the table, and walked down the trail to where the car was parked. I didn't stop until I was out of the woods and back on a real road with traffic and signs and noise. I called the police. They searched for 3 days. Dogs, drones, volunteers. They found the second cabin. They found the scraps of clothing, the water bottle, the prints. But no body, no blood, no signs of a struggle, no sign of my brother. They asked me a lot of questions. I told them everything I saw. They said it wasn't enough. They said people get lost all the time. They said maybe he hit his head. Maybe he wandered off. Maybe he drowned. I don't believe it. I saw that second cabin again online. Not in an article. Not in a report. On a forum. Someone posted pictures of it. Said they found it while camping off-grid near the same lake. Said it looked like someone had been living there, but not recently. Said they found bones. A boot. A shredded backpack. Same spot. They didn't report it. I moved away after that. Far from the woods. Far from Maine. I still don't sleep well. Sometimes I hear that same dry, crunching sound in my dreams. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Something was in those woods. Not a ghost. Not a monster. Something. I had been looking forward to a few quiet days at the cabin for months. My job had been draining me lately, and I needed some real time away from everything. No emails, no phone calls, no people, just me, a stack of old paperbacks, and the woods. I had rented this cabin online after seeing pictures of a simple wooden place tucked deep into the forest near a small lake. It looked peaceful, like something out of a nature magazine. I didn't want luxury. I just wanted quiet, solitude, maybe some fishing, maybe some hiking, just me and the trees. The drive up was long and winding. Once I left the main highway, the GPS showed nothing but a thin gray line through what seemed like endless woods. The roads got narrower and bumpier the deeper I went. I passed no other cars. The cell signal dropped completely by the time I turned off onto the gravel road that led to the cabin. I had downloaded the map ahead of time just in case. The road itself was about 3 miles long, surrounded on both sides by thick woods. The trees crowded close to the path, and their branches hung low, brushing against the top of my car. I rolled down the window and breathed in the cold, pine-scented air. Felt good. I felt good. The cabin came into view suddenly around a bend. It was smaller than I expected. Older, too. The wood siding looked weathered, almost gray, and the tin roof had some rust spots along the edge. But it was standing and it had charm. A front porch with a single chair, a heavy wooden door, 2 windows out front. The lake was just beyond the clearing. The water was still and dark. There was a narrow dock sticking out a little ways into the lake. Everything was quiet, just the rustling of the wind through the trees. Inside the cabin, it was sparse but comfortable. A small kitchen, a short hallway leading to a bedroom and a bathroom, and a main room with a fireplace, a couch, and a low wooden table. There were a few old lamps, and everything smelled faintly of cedar and ash. I unpacked my food, laid out the books I brought, and took a deep breath. No noise, no neighbors, just the sound of the forest. The first night passed quietly. I sat on the porch for a long time, just watching the lake. The sky turned orange and then purple. I didn't hear a single car or voice, just frogs and birds and the occasional rustle in the trees. I went to bed early, and I slept hard. The quiet was complete. The second day, I went for a walk in the woods. I didn't wander far, just around the lake and through the trees behind the cabin. There was a small trail that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and I followed it for a bit. I saw deer tracks, heard woodpeckers tapping, and found a pile of old branches that looked like a beaver had been working nearby. It was peaceful. That night, I cooked some canned chili on the old stove, drank a beer, and read until my eyes hurt. It was sometime in the early hours of the morning that I woke up. I wasn't sure what had stirred me. There was no sound. I lay there listening, waiting. The cabin creaked every so often, but that was normal. I didn't hear anything unusual. I turned over and went back to sleep. The third day was colder. The wind had picked up, and the clouds had moved in. I stayed inside for most of it, only going out briefly to get some firewood from the small shed next to the cabin. The shed was old and crooked, but inside was a decent stack of dry wood. I filled the fireplace and lit it that evening. The warmth filled the main room and made it feel more homey. I didn't have much of an appetite, so I ate some crackers and cheese and drank water straight from the glass bottle I'd brought. That night, I woke up again. This time, I knew what had woken me. There was a sound, a light, quick sound, like footsteps on the porch. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. I listened. The sound stopped. I heard the wind pick up, then fade. I got out of bed slowly and stepped over to the window. The porch was empty. I stared out into the trees, my eyes adjusting to the dim moonlight. Nothing moved. I stood there for a minute before shaking it off. Probably an animal, I told myself. A raccoon, maybe. I went back to bed. The next morning, I walked around the cabin looking for tracks. The ground was soft from rain a few days before, and I saw a few marks near the steps. Could have been a raccoon, maybe a fox. Hard to tell. I let it go. Still, something about it stuck in my mind. That night, I bolted the door and dragged a chair in front of it, just in case. That night, it happened again. This time, it was more than footsteps. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a loud thud against the side of the cabin. Then silence. My heart was pounding. I sat up in bed and stared into the darkness. Then came another sound, something brushing up against the wall outside. Slow, deliberate. I got out of bed and crept into the living room. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was cold. I stood there, listening. Then I heard it again. A thud, against the back of the cabin this time. I stayed still, trying to place it. It didn't sound like an animal anymore. It sounded heavier, more focused. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and stood near the window, but I didn't see anything. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the living room with the poker in my hand until the sky began to lighten and the birds started chirping. In the daylight, everything looked normal. I walked around the cabin again and saw some marks on the wood. Scrapes, almost, like someone had dragged something along the wall. I checked the lock on the shed and found it unlatched. I knew I had locked it. I was sure of it. Inside, nothing looked missing, but some of the wood had been pulled out and dropped on the ground. I cleaned it up and locked the shed again. Then I double-checked the cabin's doors and windows. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself I was just being jumpy, that I had come here to be alone, and now that my mind was playing tricks on me. That night, I kept the fireplace going and stayed up reading as late as I could. I was too tired to be afraid, but at 3 a.m., I heard it again. Not footsteps, not a thud. This time, it was a dragging sound, like something being slowly pulled across the porch. I froze. I turned off the lamp. The room went dark. I waited. The dragging sound stopped. Then I heard a soft creak, the sound of weight shifting on the porch boards. Someone or something was standing there. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited for what felt like forever. Then a sudden, sharp knock on the door. Just once. Then nothing. I didn't move from my chair until the sun came up. I packed that morning, quickly. I didn't bother folding anything. I shoved it all into my duffel and dragged it to the car. I loaded up and slammed the trunk. I took one last look at the cabin and turned to get in the driver's seat. And that's when I saw it. On the far side of the clearing, just at the tree line, there was something. A shape, a man, standing still, just inside the shadows. I stared. He didn't move. He just stood there. I couldn't make out his face. Just a figure, arms at his sides, watching me. I didn't wait. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I backed out fast, spinning some gravel, then took off down the dirt road. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove all the way back to the main road before I let myself breathe. I filed a report with the rental site when I got home. They said no one else had access to the property. No maintenance crews, no forest rangers nearby, no hikers allowed in that area. The owner said no one had stayed there in months before me. I asked about cameras. There were none. I asked if anything like this had happened before. They said no. I didn't press it. I didn't want to think about it anymore. For weeks after, I kept checking over my shoulder. At night, I thought I heard sounds in my yard. I stopped going out after dark. Eventually, things returned to normal. But I never forgot that feeling, that stillness, that shape in the woods, the dragging sound on the porch. The knock, it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some story to scare kids around a campfire. It was real. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and if I hadn't left when I did, I don't know what would have happened. All I know is that I'll never go back to that cabin. I'll never stay in the woods alone again. And when the wind picks up at night, and I hear something creak outside my window, I always wonder, was it just the wind, or did something follow me home? It started with a simple plan to get away for the weekend. I had been feeling burned out from work. The noise, the screens, the meetings, it was getting to me. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere with trees and open air and no one around. I found a cabin listing online. It wasn't fancy, just a small place tucked away in the woods of northern Vermont, miles from the nearest town. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no neighbors. The photos showed a one-room structure with a fireplace, a small bed, and a kitchen that looked just functional enough. It had an outhouse out back and a fire pit out front. It looked like exactly what I needed. I left early Friday morning. The drive took longer than I expected. The last 30 miles were on a narrow, winding dirt road that barely looked used. The trees got thicker the farther I went. After a while, I stopped seeing houses or cars. It was just trees and rocks and the crunch of my tires on loose gravel. I passed a rusted-out pickup truck in a ditch at one point. It looked like it had been there for years. That was the only sign of life I saw before reaching the cabin. The place looked a little more worn than in the photos, but it was still standing and the key was right where the owner said it would be, in a rusted lockbox under a rock. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. It was quiet, really quiet. No humming appliances, no road noise, no buzzing lights. Just the occasional creak of the wooden walls and the wind brushing the trees outside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, wood, dust, maybe a little mildew. The air was cold and damp. I dropped my bag on the bed and walked around. The floorboards were uneven and soft in places. There were cobwebs in the corners, a few dead flies on the windowsill. The fireplace looked functional, though, and the kitchen had a few mismatched pans and a kettle. There was a stack of firewood next to the hearth and a lantern on the counter. I lit the lantern and opened a small window to let some fresh air in. It was still early afternoon, but the light already looked thin and gray. The forest pressed up close against every wall of the cabin. The trees were dense and tall, branches tangled together like a net. I couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. I spent the rest of the day collecting kindling, unpacking a few things, and trying to settle in. I cooked a simple meal, beans and rice, and ate by the fire. By the time it got dark, the temperature had dropped fast. I added logs to the fire, zipped my jacket all the way up, and sat on the bed with a book. I couldn't focus on it. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something outside, branches snapping, leaves crunching. But every time I paused and listened, there was only silence. I told myself it was just wildlife. Squirrels, deer, maybe a raccoon. That night, I barely slept. The darkness in the woods was absolute. No moon, no stars, just black pressing in from all sides. I kept waking up, heart pounding. Sure, I had heard footsteps or breathing just outside the window. At one point, I got up and opened the door to look. Nothing, just trees and cold air. I started to feel a little stupid. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. My brain was probably just filling in the silence with imagined noises. I went back to bed and eventually drifted off again. The next morning, the sun was out, but it didn't help much. The air was still cold and the sky was a dull gray. I made coffee on the stovetop and sat on the front steps for a while, listening to the forest. It was beautiful in a raw kind of way. Moss-covered rocks, wet leaves, tree trunks so thick it would take two people to wrap their arms around them. I decided to go for a walk. There was no real trail, but the owner had mentioned a small clearing about a half-mile west of the cabin. said it was a good spot to sit and watch for birds. I set out with a small backpack, some water, and a folding knife just in case. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in fallen branches and slippery roots. I had to keep checking my compass to stay on track. After about 20 minutes, I found the clearing. It was just a flat patch of mossy ground surrounded by huge trees. The light filtered down in soft patches, and I sat on a log for a while, drinking water and listening. That was when I noticed something strange. Near the far edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet away, there was a pile of rocks. Not just random rocks, stacked ones, carefully placed one on top of the other, like someone had built a marker or a small cairn. It didn't look old. The stones weren't mossy, and the dirt around them looked freshly disturbed. I walked over to look at it. There were 3 piles total, each maybe a foot tall. No markings, no patterns, just stacks. I crouched down and touched one. It was cold and slightly damp. I had no idea what they meant, if anything. Maybe someone else had stayed out here recently. Maybe it was just a weird hobby. I stood up and looked around. The forest felt different now, less peaceful, heavier. I walked back to the cabin slowly, glancing over my shoulder more often than I wanted to admit. I kept thinking about those rocks. When I got back, I checked the firewood, brought in a few more logs, and stayed inside for the rest of the day. That night, I barely ate. I didn't feel hungry. I just sat by the fire, reading and listening to the woods. Around 10 o'clock, I heard something outside. Not just a branch or a rustle. Something heavier, a definite thump, like a boot hitting the wooden steps. I froze. The fire crackled behind me. My hands were cold even though the room was warm. I stood up slowly and walked to the door. I didn't open it. I leaned close and listened. Nothing. I waited 5 minutes, maybe 10. Still nothing. I finally opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. There were footprints. In the soft dirt leading up to the steps, clear as day boot prints. Not mine. They were too big and too wide. They came from the direction of the woods and stopped right at the bottom step. Then they turned around and went back the same way. I followed them a few steps with my flashlight. They disappeared into the trees. No other tracks around. No sign of anyone. Just those prints. I went back inside and locked the door. I checked the windows. All closed. Nothing broken. I sat up most of the night with the fire going, heart pounding every time a twig snapped outside. The next day, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a hunter passed through. Maybe he saw the cabin, realized someone was inside, and left. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching. I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the knife in my pocket all day and moved the firewood inside just in case I needed to barricade the door. Around noon, I heard something in the woods, far off, but loud. A kind of cracking sound. Then again, closer. I grabbed the axe and stepped out, heart racing. Nothing. I stood there for 10 minutes scanning the trees. Just silence again. Later that afternoon, I walked back to the clearing. I don't know why. I think I just wanted to see if the rock piles were still there. They weren't. The spot was bare. No piles, no disturbed dirt. Nothing. It was like they'd never been there. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat with my back against the wall, the fire burning low, the axe in my lap. I didn't hear anything, but I kept seeing things through the windows. Flickers of movement, shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. A shape just at the edge of the trees, then gone. By the time the sun came up, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed everything in 10 minutes, didn't even bother cleaning up. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just threw my stuff in the car, locked the cabin behind me, and drove. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to come out of the woods. I didn't see anyone. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, nearly an hour later. I pulled over at a gas station and sat in the car for a long time. Eventually I went inside, bought coffee, and used the bathroom. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I looked 10 years older. Pale, drawn, eyes sunken. I never went back to that cabin. I never contacted the owner or left a review. I never even opened the photos again. A week later, I saw a post online about a missing hiker in the same area. No details, just that he had gone into the woods and never come out. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe it? There were no ghosts, no creatures, no strange lights. Just a pile of rocks that shouldn't have been there. Footprints that weren't mine. Sounds that kept getting closer. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Not because I'm afraid of what might be out there, but because I know someone is. Someone real. Someone who doesn't want to be seen. And I think for one weekend they saw me. I had been looking forward to the break for months. Work had been grinding me down, and I just needed to get away from everything. Emails, traffic, city noise, even people. I found a listing for a remote cabin about 3 hours outside of where I lived. It was described as peaceful, secluded, and surrounded by forest in every direction. No neighbors, no roads nearby. You had to drive 10 miles on a gravel trail to even reach it. That sounded perfect. The pictures looked good. A simple wooden cabin with a small porch, a fire pit out front, and a dense wall of trees in the background. Inside, it had the basics. A bed, a wood stove, a tiny kitchen area, and a bathroom with running water from a well. The place didn't have Wi-Fi or cell service, but that was part of the appeal. I left early Friday morning and reached the last gas station before the cabin by noon. I topped off the tank and bought a few extra supplies just in case. The sky was clear, the air was cool, and the forest smelled like pine and dirt. I followed the directions the owner emailed me, turned off the main road, and took the long gravel path through the woods. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became. I didn't see a single car or person. No houses, just trees on both sides. Eventually, I saw the cabin through the trees. It looked just like the photos, maybe a little older, but still solid. I parked beside it, got out, and stretched my legs. There was no wind, no noise, just silence. I unlocked the front door, brought my bags inside, and started to settle in. The place was small but clean. There was a couch near the wood stove, a small table, and a little kitchen with a propane burner. The bed was pushed against the far wall under a window that looked out into the woods. There were fresh sheets and a blanket folded neatly at the foot. It smelled faintly like wood smoke and something else I couldn't place. Not bad, just different. Old, maybe. I unpacked, then stepped outside to get some fresh air. There was no signal on my phone as expected. I looked around the clearing and walked a short distance into the woods to get a feel for the area. The trees were tall and thick. No trails, no markings, just endless trunks stretching in every direction. It was quiet. Too quiet, actually. I realized how used to background noise I was. Traffic, birds, distant voices. Here it was just stillness. That first night, I made a small fire in the pit and cooked a can of chili. I listened to the fire crackle, stared up at the stars, and felt the stress start to melt off. When the air turned cold, I put the fire out, locked the cabin, and turned in for the night. I woke up once around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. The window over the bed let in a little moonlight, just enough to see by. The forest outside was pitch black. I felt that kind of deep, total darkness you don't get in the city. Felt like the trees were pressing in on all sides. I didn't stay up long. Used the bathroom, climbed back into bed, and eventually drifted off. The next day was slow and easy. I spent most of it reading, chopping some firewood from the stack behind the cabin, and walking around the clearing. Around sunset, I was sitting on the porch when I noticed something strange. In the distance, at the edge of the clearing, I saw what looked like a tree that had been cut. Not fallen, cut clean like with a blade. I hadn't seen it the day before. It stood out because everything else was wild and untouched. This looked deliberate. I walked over to check it out. The stump was fresh, the cut was clean, and the wood still smelled sharp. A few chips of bark and sawdust were still around the base. I looked for a fallen tree nearby but didn't see it. Just the stump. No sign of tools, no footprints, no trail. I figured maybe the owner had come by recently to clear something, though I hadn't seen or heard anyone. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Not because of fear, just an odd feeling. The woods felt different, heavier. There were no animal sounds. I lay in bed listening to nothing for a long time, and then finally drifted off sometime past midnight. I woke up suddenly to the sound of wood cracking. Not like the cabin shifting or the stove creaking. This was sharper, closer, like a branch breaking under weight. I sat up and listened. Silence. Then a soft crunch. Footsteps. Slow. Just outside the cabin. I held my breath. The sound came from the backside of the building. Then nothing. I waited, heart pounding. I didn't hear it again. After what felt like 10 minutes, I climbed out of bed and moved to the window by the kitchen. I looked out but couldn't see anything. Total darkness. I stood there for a long time trying to hear something. Anything. But the woods had gone back to dead quiet. I ended up staying awake until the sun started to rise. When daylight came, I walked around the cabin to look for signs. Prints, broken branches, anything. I didn't see anything unusual. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, so it wasn't easy to tell. Maybe I imagined it, or maybe it was an animal. I kept telling myself that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to go about my day, but every little sound made me look up. I didn't go as far into the woods. I kept checking over my shoulder. That night, I didn't sit outside. I stayed in, kept the wood stove going, and locked all the windows. I read with a flashlight and tried to distract myself. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was a dull thump, like something had bumped against the porch. Not heavy, just enough to make a sound. I turned off the flashlight and sat still. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, there was a second thump. Slower, more deliberate. I moved to the window near the front door and peeked out. It was too dark to see anything. I thought about turning on the porch light, but didn't want to give away my position. I waited. After a long silence, I heard movement again, this time heading toward the back of the cabin. I moved quietly to the other side and looked out through the bedroom window. There, in the moonlight, I saw something move. Just a shape. Not clear, but it was low to the ground and it moved slowly. It wasn't walking upright. Crawled. Then it stopped, just beyond the edge of the trees, and didn't move again. I stayed frozen. My mouth went dry. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the shape melted back into the trees. At first light, I packed up my things. I didn't care that I had 2 more nights booked. I loaded everything into the car and got ready to leave. But when I reached the gravel trail, I found something that stopped me cold. A large branch had been placed across the path. Not fallen, placed. It looked like it had been dragged there recently. The marks in the dirt were fresh. It wasn't big enough to stop my car, but it was clear. Someone had put it there. I didn't stop to think. I backed up, drove around the branch, and headed back toward the road. My hands were tight on the wheel, eyes on the woods the whole time. I didn't see anyone. No cars. No other cabins. Just trees, tall and unmoving. When I finally reached the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station an hour away. I filled up, used the bathroom, and checked my phone. Dozens of missed messages. I didn't answer them. I just sat in my car for a long time, heart still thudding. I didn't report it. What would I say? I hadn't seen a face. Nothing was stolen. I wasn't hurt. And honestly, I didn't want to think about it anymore. I went home, and for days I didn't sleep right. Every creak of my apartment made me jump. Later, I went back to the cabin listing just to see if it was still up. It was gone. Completely removed. I searched the address. Nothing. No trace of it. I never figured out who was out there. I never found out what they wanted. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. Maybe they were waiting for something. I don't know. But I'll never forget the way that shape moved through the trees. Slow. Watching. Waiting. Whatever it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some creature from a story. It was a person. A real one. That's what scares me the most. Because someone was out there, crawling around in the woods outside that cabin. And they weren't just passing through. They were waiting. And I don't think I was the first person they watched. And I'm scared I might not be the last. I hadn't planned to spend the night in that cabin. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a way to disconnect from the world, to escape the noise and distractions. But from the moment I pulled up to that cabin, something felt off. It wasn't a large cabin, just a small, weathered building tucked away in the woods, far from the nearest town. The kind of place you'd expect to find in a horror movie. Its wooden exterior was chipped and gray from years of exposure to the elements, with moss growing in patches along the roof. The porch sagged slightly, and the windows were dark, staring back at me like hollow eyes. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was just the remoteness of the place making it seem eerie. I'd arrived a few hours before sunset, the drive up winding and slow as I navigated the narrow forest road. The last stretch of the journey had been through a thick stretch of woods, the trees closing in around me like a tunnel. I could barely see beyond the car's headlights, the darkness of the forest swallowing up everything in sight. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked the car and stepped out. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled of damp earth and pine, the kind of air that felt alive, almost. I stood there for a moment, listening to the distant rustle of leaves, the faint call of an owl. I had no idea who owned the cabin. I'd rented it through an online service. The description had seemed perfect. Secluded, peaceful, great for hiking, and far away from the chaos of everyday life. It wasn't the first time I'd done something like this. A weekend alone in a quiet place, surrounded by nature, was exactly what I needed. But as I walked up the porch steps and reached for the old brass handle on the door, something in the pit of my stomach tightened. I paused for a moment, wondering if I had made the right choice. The door creaked as it opened. The inside of the cabin was dark and smelled faintly of mildew, the air stale from disuse. I flicked on the light switch, but only the faintest glow appeared. The bulb was weak, casting a dim light over the main room. The walls were lined with mismatched furniture, most of it old and worn. The couch looked like it had seen better days, the cushions sagging, and the rug on the floor was faded, its edges curling up. There was a small fireplace in the corner, the hearth empty. A couple of chairs sat around a coffee table, but it all felt off, like someone had tried to make the place cozy but didn't care enough to finish the job. I walked through the cabin, unpacking my things in the small bedroom at the back. The bed was a simple frame with a thick quilt folded at the foot, but the sheets were clean, so I didn't mind. The window in the bedroom looked out over the woods, the tall trees just visible in the fading light. I didn't feel at ease looking out at the darkening forest. Felt like something was waiting out there, watching, but I pushed the thought away. I wasn't going to let my mind get the best of me. I spent the evening alone, making a small dinner in the kitchen, the sounds of the woods outside the only noise. The wind rustled through the trees, and I could hear the occasional snap of a twig. The isolation was both peaceful and unsettling. As I ate, I felt like I was being pulled in two directions. Half of me wanted to enjoy the quiet, while the other half was uneasy, sensing something just beyond my awareness. After eating, I settled in front of the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. The warmth was comforting, but the longer I sat there, the more I felt like I was being stared at. It was a strange feeling, like someone was in the room with me, though I was alone. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The evening wore on, and the fire slowly died down. The cabin grew colder, the chill creeping in through the walls. I decided to go to bed, pulling the quilt up around me. But even as I lay there, trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence of the woods outside was oppressive. It pressed in on me, and every creak of the floorboards or groan of the cabin seemed louder than it should have been. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the rising unease. But then came a sound, a soft tapping on the window. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. First, I thought it was just the wind. Maybe a branch had brushed against the glass. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up, my legs feeling shaky as I approached the window. There was nothing outside, just the dark forest. The tap, tap, tap stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting, watching. I pulled the curtains shut, trying to ignore the creeping fear in my chest. I lay back down, my mind racing. The tapping had stopped, but the tension in the cabin was thick, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. The night passed slowly. I didn't sleep much, tossing and turning, the unease growing with each passing hour. And then, just as I was beginning to drift into an uneasy sleep, I heard it. A knock on the door. I froze. My heart stopped. The sound was faint at first, like a gentle rapping, but unmistakable. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Who could be out there? No one should have been near the cabin. I had seen no one on my way in, and there were no other houses around for miles. I waited, but there was no second knock, no other sound. Just silence. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to get up and approach the door. I slowly made my way to the front, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. As I reached for the handle, my mind screamed at me to stop. What if it wasn't safe to open the door? What if there was someone out there? But I had to know. I couldn't just stay inside, trapped by fear. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peer outside. The night was cold, the trees swaying in the wind, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, the shadows deep and impenetrable. I quickly closed the door, locking it behind me. I sat down in the small living room, my mind racing. My breath was shallow, my body tense. I tried to calm myself, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night awake, watching the shadows dance along the walls, listening for any sound that might break the silence. But there was nothing, just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The next morning, I decided to leave. I wasn't going to stay another night in that place. I packed my things quickly, the tension in my chest only growing as I moved. As I stepped outside, I glanced around the porch one last time, searching for any sign of what had happened. But there was nothing, just the empty forest. I started the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the cabin was already fading into the distance, swallowed up by the trees. And with it, the sense of unease that had clung to me. As the miles stretched between me and that cabin, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I had just escaped something far worse than I could ever explain. I never went back. I had been working nonstop for months, and the pressure of city life was starting to eat away at me. I didn't realize how burned out I had become until I caught myself falling asleep at my desk, barely remembering the last few days. That's when I decided to take a break. A real break. No phone, no email, no people. Just quiet. I found a small cabin listed online, deep in the woods of Vermont, far from anything and anyone. The pictures made it look plain but peaceful: wooden walls, a small front porch, a wood-burning stove, and an old trail leading into thick forest. It was exactly what I needed. The owner was an older man who barely spoke in his emails. He just sent me a code to the lockbox and directions that sounded more like something out of an old map than anything GPS would understand. It took me almost half a day to drive there, the last stretch winding down a narrow dirt road where tree branches reached low enough to scrape the roof of my car. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip, casting a golden-orange light over everything. It was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. No cars, no people talking, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and birds calling somewhere far off. The cabin was basic. No running water, just a pump outside. Electricity ran from a small generator that was only good for a few hours at a time. There was a compost toilet in a little outhouse behind the trees. Inside, the place was just one room. A bed in the corner, a small kitchen with a gas stove, a wood-burning fireplace, a couple chairs, and shelves filled with canned food, candles, matches, and some basic tools. The air inside smelled of dry wood and dust. I liked it right away. I spent the first 2 days doing nothing but sitting on the porch and walking short distances into the woods behind the cabin. The air was fresh and cold in the mornings and warm by the afternoon. At night, I'd light a fire in the stove and read one of the books I brought, or just lie in bed listening to the wind tapping against the windows. The kind of peace that felt unfamiliar, like something I used to know before life got so noisy. It wasn't until the third night that I started noticing things. Small things at first. When I woke up in the morning, I found the firewood stacked slightly differently than I remembered. Once, I could have sworn I had left the axe leaned up against the shed outside, but it was stuck in the chopping block instead. I figured I just didn't remember clearly. I was relaxed, maybe too relaxed. My brain wasn't used to not running constantly, and I figured it was just adjusting. But then came the noises. The fourth night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. It wasn't a dream that woke me, but something else. Something outside. I didn't hear it at first. I just had the heavy feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard a soft crunch, like a footstep on leaves. It wasn't an animal. I've camped enough to know the difference. This was slow, heavy, and deliberate. I sat up in bed, barely breathing, listening. The sound came again. Another crunch, then silence. I waited, barely moving, staring at the wall like it would somehow show me what was outside. I told myself it was probably a deer or something big moving through the woods. The area was remote and wildlife was part of the deal. Still, I got out of bed and made sure the door was locked. The windows too. Then I went back to bed. But I didn't sleep. I just lay there in the dark, listening to every creak and rustle like they were Morse code for something bad about to happen. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. There were tracks. Not boot prints exactly, but the ground was disturbed in several places. It had rained lightly the day before, and the soil was soft. Something or someone had walked around the cabin. The grass was bent, and the leaves were crushed in a long curve that led from the woods to the side of the house and back again. My chest tightened as I followed the trail, trying to make sense of it. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was an animal, something heavy. A bear maybe, but the pattern was strange. It went too close to the cabin, right along the wall where the bed was, like someone was walking slowly, almost dragging their feet. I went back inside and locked the door again, even though it was still mid-morning. That day I didn't go far. I chopped wood, boiled water, and stayed within eyesight of the porch. Every time I thought I heard something, I stopped and listened. I didn't see anyone. I told myself I was being paranoid. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the window watching the dark. Around midnight I heard it again. This time there were more footsteps. Not just one set, two, then silence. The sound of breathing close. It was faint but distinct. I leaned forward, heart pounding, and stared out the window. I couldn't see anything in the dark, just the outline of the trees and the soft glow from the moon. But I knew something was out there. I could feel it. Something watching, waiting. Then, just before dawn, I heard the crunch of leaves again, retreating this time, going back into the woods. I should have left then. I knew that, but something in me didn't want to believe it was real. Maybe it was a local messing with me. Maybe a hunter who thought the cabin was empty. Maybe just kids. That seemed unlikely given how remote it was, but I needed some explanation that wasn't the worst-case scenario. So I stayed another night. One more night, I told myself. Then I'd pack up and go home. I set up traps. Nothing fancy. Just some string tied with small bells around the trees near the cabin. If someone walked through, I'd hear it. I kept the axe inside with me. I didn't want to use it, but I needed something just in case. I stayed up again, listening, staring out the windows. Around 1 a.m., the first bell jingled. Just one, soft and quick. Then nothing. I stood by the door, barely breathing. Then another bell. Then another. The sound was moving, slowly, around the cabin. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want to let them know I was awake. Then I heard a thud. Something hit the side of the cabin. Not hard, but enough to make the wall creak. Then came another sound, metal scraping against wood. I crept to the window and peeked out. I couldn't see anything clearly, just movement. Something crouched low near the firewood pile. Then it was gone, just gone. I stood there for what felt like an hour, waiting. Then, finally, silence again. At sunrise, I went outside. The bells had been cut, clean like with a knife. One was missing completely. The firewood pile was disturbed again. The axe I'd brought inside was the only weapon I had, and I kept it gripped tightly in my hand as I circled the cabin. I saw more tracks, more broken leaves, more disturbed earth. But no people, no faces, just the feeling that I was being hunted. I went inside, packed everything as fast as I could, and got in the car. The drive back out of the woods felt like hours. Every time I slowed for a turn, I expected to see someone step out of the trees, but I never did. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over and just sat there, hands shaking on the wheel. I looked back once, just trees, still, silent, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I never reported it. What would I say? That I heard footsteps? That someone stole a bell? There wasn't any real proof, just fear. But that fear was real. It still is. Sometimes when it's quiet at night, I still hear that bell in my head. The soft jingle of it being pulled free from the string. The scrape of metal on wood. The slow, heavy crunch of leaves outside my door. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I don't rent strange cabins. And when something doesn't feel right, I listen to that feeling. I don't try to explain it away, because somewhere out there, deep in the quiet parts of the world, there are people who don't want to be seen. People who watch from the shadows, moving only when they know you're asleep. And the scariest part isn't what they do, it's what they don't do. They wait, they learn, they make you question yourself. And when they finally move, they do it without sound, without warning, without reason. I left that cabin, but something from it stayed with me. The knowledge that I was never alone. Not really, not ever.